the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine widens, our hearts continue to go out to the country and its courageous citizenry. Here at the University of South Florida, I want to express our deep support for our Ukrainian students, faculty, and staff. USF is proud to partner with leading experts and organizations to bring to you the latest insights on how the evolving situation in Ukraine impacts the world and you through the Ukraine What's Next series. Today, we focus on financial and economic impacts with partners Cumberland Advisors and the Global Interdependence Center. Thank you to our sponsors, presenters, and partners, and we hope you enjoy the program.
I'm Casey Welch. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership here at the University of South Florida. The Institute is focused on engaging the strong academic resources of the university and partnering with local and global experts to guide a dynamic exchange of ideas on policy issues and leadership decisions. IPPL is proud to partner on this series with the Florida West Coast chapter of the Air Force Association, Cyber Florida at the University of South Florida, the Global Interdependence Center, Cumberland Advisors, Security Management International, the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee Campus, and USF Research One. Be sure to join us for Part 3 of Cybersecurity Analysis on May 10th, and in Part 4, Diplomatic and Humanitarian Aspects on May 24th. Part 1 focused on the military intelligence aspects of the Ukraine, and our leader for that session was Major General Scott Gray, who's joining us again today. And for updates and perspective, General Gray.
Well, good morning. I am the president of the Florida West Coast chapter of the Air Force Association. I want to thank the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee Campus for getting involved with this and allowing this to happen. I think this thing has legs, and I think we're going to continue to go well past the next two sessions, I hope, okay? There's not a single event going on in my lifetime bigger than this one right now today. This has implications of going worldwide if it's not contained. I think political leaders are finally unifying themselves and coming together. We just had our Secretary of Defense over at Ramstein Air Force Base meeting with other world defense leaders taking a look at this situation. The humanitarian implications alone are profound and worldwide, and they're growing. Right now today, you have probably close to 3 million women and children that are refugees that will probably never see their husbands, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, brothers again. All right. This is a major, major worldwide implication. And the fact that this university is taking this on is just an amazing accomplishment for us as citizens of Sarasota and Manatee County. So again, my thank you for your involvement with this, and all of the sponsors that have helped this happen. I woke up in the middle of the night and I said, wow, what could we do? And through a close contact, I was able to get in touch with Dr. Holbrook. And this is the result of that. She was able to leverage the university and partners of the university to make this real. So thank you for joining in. As I said, right now today, this is the single largest worldwide event going on in our lifetime, and we need to pay close attention to it. So thank you very much for joining in.
Thank you, General Gray. Just a few housekeeping items. For those of you here in the Selby Auditorium, we'll have a box lunch at noon today, and you can enjoy here on our campus. Online participants, if you would submit your questions into the chat, we will answer them to the best of our ability. And those of you here in the Selby Auditorium, if you'll write them on note cards and pass them to our staff here, we'll take care of them. And at this time, I would like to introduce our Regional Chancellor for the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee Campus, Dr. Karen Holbrook.
Thank you, Casey, very much, and welcome to everybody here and everybody online. We are delighted that you're with us today, and I have to thank the General. This would never have happened if we hadn't gotten together, and within a matter of a week or two, we had this thing all planned, simply because he had the idea and we grasped it as something that's really important for this university. So I have a job to do this morning, two things. One is tell you a little bit about our university, and I won't go on long. And then secondly, to introduce David Kotok and a little bit more about what David has meant to us at the university. Our university, as you might know, is the smallest of the 3 University of South Florida campuses, but all 3 of us are now consolidated. Since the last time most of you were here, our last event, we have all come together as one university. What does that mean? It means a lot more to us. It means that our students have a lot more programs they can take part in. They can now participate in 257 undergraduate programs. That's huge for our local students, and our local students are being prepared for our community because most of them live here and will stay here, and that's something we're very excited about. So being part of a consolidated university that is a preeminent university, a world recognized research university is really very important, and it means our students go out with the greatest of preparation. So we're pretty excited about that. And for those of you who've been here before and seen our one beautiful building, when you come next time, not quite next time, but pretty soon, when you come, there will be more than one. We're going to have 2 more buildings out here. The first one is going to be, we should have a shovel in the ground this fall so that we get students from students from countries and students from around our country. So we should have students from all over here because it'll be a residence hall and a student center. And then our goal is to have another building out there, a new academic building. That one's a little less certain as to when that might take place, but for the first time ever, we're talking about actually building a second academic building that will be called the Nursing STEM Building to bring in a lot of our STEM disciplines, a lot of research opportunities, and to increase our nursing program. And that sort of leads me into David Kotok. David has been our friend for, gosh, I've been here 5 years and we've known David all 5 years. In fact, when David and I first met, David was the one who was dedicating the Bloomberg terminals to this campus. We have 12 Bloomberg terminals. Thank you to David Kotok. This is a big deal. This is more than the Tampa campus. This is more than most universities have. But what it means is that our students who are prepared on Bloomberg terminals go out to better jobs with higher paying salaries. So this is wonderful. Now, what David doesn't really know, and I don't know if we've lost Eddie Sanchez, I think we have, he was here earlier, but Eddie Sanchez has taken them into the high schools because we have a dual enrollment program where our juniors and seniors in high schools locally can take USF courses. What does that mean? That means that they have part of their education already paid for when they come into college as seniors and juniors and seniors, and some sophomores, of course. But we also have in some of those schools now Bloomberg terminals. We started on a pilot this year, and we're going to expand it to more high schools. So thanks, David, for starting that. But that isn't all David's done. Just if you don't know David, let me just mention a little bit about him. He was the one that started Cumberland Advisors in 1973 and has been the chief investment officer ever since. We're lucky that he's here in Sarasota. It's wonderful to have David here. David has also been on the GIC, the Global Interdependence Board, for a long time. And the GIC, along with Cumberland Advisors, have been great supporters of many of our programs here. We are so grateful to you, David, for all of what you've done. So besides the Bloomberg terminal, David has also been part of a nursing program. You say, well, that's very different from finance, but it isn't. It's something David's very passionate about, is building our nursing program and building nursing resilience so that our nurses stay in the program. And with Christine, he has built this program up with Sarasota Memorial Healthcare as well. So that's another thing that David's been passionate about. And he's helped us in the community with developing a large number of programs. Seminars on Cuba and the Caribbean, adapting to climate change, and the person of climate change is Bob Bunting, who's here with us, and has built programs along with David that are very, very valuable and important. Post-election financial markets. And for a number of years until COVID hit, David was also working with us on financial literacy, which were really invaluable programs. So I'm going to say just a little bit more about David. His articles and financial market commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and other publications. He's a frequent contributor to Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg Radio, Yahoo Finance TV, and other media. He's co-authored or authored 4 books, including the second edition, From Bear to Bull, with ETFs and Adventures in Muniland. And he has a new book that's coming on. I don't know if you're going to say anything about it, David. You might. But David is always busy, always thinking, always doing great things, and always contributing to this community and to this university. So, David, I know you want to get up because you're tired of hearing about you, but I couldn't leave any of this out because he's been so valuable and important to us and today as well. Thank you. You're great.
Thank you very much, Karen. I don't have a clue who you're talking about, but in an economy of time and with the arrangements for today, which is a hybrid event, and essentially the auditorium audience is a TV audience. So we're going to have to run this. And last night at dinner, General Gray and I had conversation. We said the conference has to run like a military operation because it's the cameras and the timing that will drive the sequence. So I have some remarks which I'll save for the end. I agree with General Gray. We are in a massive shock, unlike anything any of us have ever considered. And when we had the first conversation, which was the beginning, the program you put together, Scott, on the military side, the discussion was the military side currently is in a region, but the financial economic side is worldwide, and it is expanding worldwide, and it is of a size and scope that we have never experienced before. So we have 2 panels, 2 sessions. I want to thank the speakers. Some traveled here yesterday and are flying back. You'll hear them. They'll be in person, and those who could not. And then we have a keynote speaker from a former governor of the Central Bank of Poland, who is just back from Poland and who is on the Global Interdependence Center. She's a fellow in the College of Central Bankers. We'll hear from her. And at about 10 minutes to 12, let me then summarize. So without further ado, it's great for Cumberland advisors to be back in business after 2 years with the University of South Florida. And we've put together a great program. Just one quick word, since Karen was kind enough to acknowledge the Bloomberg terminals. Last night at dinner, our president, John Musso, at our speakers' dinner, described how we are increasingly able to employ in Sarasota graduates of USF who in their training included the training on Bloomberg terminals. And as John reported last night at dinner, we are in the process of adding the 7th isn't it, John? 7th. The 7th USF graduate with skills that came from this university, this business school. 7 people at Cumberland are a result of this effort, which has been going on now for a number of years. So without further ado, Bill, you got a program to run. I'll get out of the way.
Thank you very much. We're going to go into our first session, the economic reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, led by Michael McKee, the moderator, for international economics and policy correspondent for Bloomberg Television and Radio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who is joining us today in person and online. I am online. Unfortunately, I had high hopes of getting down to Sarasota. It's one of my favorite places, and I love the university itself because not only, Dr. Holbrook, do you have the great Bloomberg installation, but you have a great location, and I've been there a number of times and can't wait to go back and see your new buildings. I'm stuck in New York where it's kind of gray and it's been raining and cloudy, but in honor of the fact that it's so nice down in Sarasota today, I did wear my yellow tie to try to feel a little more spring-like. We're going to take a look first this morning at the economic impacts of the war in Ukraine, although I don't know that you can do that without bringing in all of the other issues that are before the overall economy. But we have some great people who are going to be able to address that this morning. Leland Miller is the CEO and co-founder of the China Beige Book. He, more than anybody else, studies China very, very closely, and we are looking forward to getting his insights on where they are, why they are partnering with the Russians, and what they're doing about COVID. We're going to have to ask that because obviously that has major implications for what happens to the economy forward. Holly Wade is the executive director of the National Federation of Independent Business Research Center, and they keep track of all things small business, and we have seen a distinct drop in enthusiasm for the economy from NFIB members, and we'll get Holly's perspective on that. And David Burson is the chief economist at Nationwide Insurance. David and I go back a long way, and he has a very good perspective on the overall economy, including housing, which is a major deal for the economy these days. I want to start by quoting Martin Wolf, who is a columnist for the Financial Times, has been covering economics since, I think, the Roman times. And he wrote a column today about how much trouble the world is in, and that only gets exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And here's his quote: "This war follows pestilence and threatens famine. Together, these are three of Ezekiel's four disastrous judgments of the Lord. Alas, the fourth, death, follows from the other three." Is it really that bad? Let's get started this morning. And we will start, I guess, by sort of asking each of the panelists for an overview of, in their area, where we are. Leland, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So, the best way to look at this, I think, is that in Washington, D.C., the Russian Ukraine invasion of Ukraine has sucked all the oxygen out of the air, and it has changed everything that is happening inside the halls of Congress, inside the White House, and obviously has had dramatic changes to the international situation. Look, if you look at what was likely to happen before Russia went in, you had the Biden administration. They were a couple months away, after phase one had ended. There was time to present a U.S.-China policy. It was time to present a new U.S.-China trade policy. There were a lot of foreign policy things that had gotten pushed off because of COVID, because of Build Back Better and the economic recovery program Biden was pushing, that it was just time to start a more broader approach to how Biden views the world. And they had a couple of things teed up. They had some U.S.-China policy announcements teed up. They were deep into discussions on what the new trade policy would look like and how hard the White House thought it needed to push. It needed to push the Chinese, not just to have some sort of fair framework for moving forward, but also because the midterms are approaching in November, and Biden didn't want to look, politically vulnerable to attacks that he was being soft on China. So a lot of things were getting teed up right as Russia decided to misbehave. What this has done since is create an environment where just everything has shifted. So, China used to be priority number one. It's on the back burner now. There will be an announcement about a U.S.-China policy and a framework release sometime in the next 6 weeks or so, unless it gets pushed off like the other ones have. But China is definitely a priority level down. The administration is not worrying about the idea of Biden looking weak on China. They're worried about Biden being able to push this coalition against Russia. They're worried about inflation at home and abroad. So a lot of the big things that everyone thought were going to be the big priority issues and worries and concerns and political priorities for Biden in 2022 are just off the table or on the back burner. So we're in a position where the administration is going to be challenged quite a lot in the coming months to put together a broader idea on how they should be pushing back against non-U.S. allies, not just Russia but China. How do you push China? And this is really what it comes down to. How do you push China? How do you look tough on China while not creating a retaliatory spiral with China while you're trying to get the world motivated to stay united against Russia? So this is what the administration has been tangling with, and there hasn't been a reconciliation of these goals quite yet. But this is what their goal is, to try to hammer this out in the coming months.
All right, we're going to have to go back and forth with the mute buttons, so we'll all have the delay here that I have. I'm going to turn to Holly next and ask her why, in general, things look so bad from the perspective of the small businessman or woman.
Yes. Thank you. And it's great to be with everybody. Unfortunately, I am in DC. And yes, everything has turned to Ukraine in Congress, as Leland mentioned. For small businesses, though, we've been surveying a sample of our membership, around 300,000 small business owners, for the last 48 years. And so we've seen what it looks like in times of inflation in the late 70s, early 80s. And for most small business owners, they've never experienced anything like this outside of that little blip of inflation related to energy costs in 2012 was the last time we saw a spike in those business owners saying that inflation was their single most important problem. But looking at it right now, small business owners are fairly pessimistic. And the last drop in our optimism index, which is kind of the headline measure of the small business sector, the contributing factor to the drop was business conditions in the next 6 months, what their expectations are of business conditions. And they've soured quite a bit from last December. It has gradually declined, the index. And so we're noticing that small business owners are kind of trading one set of problems related to COVID and all those mandates and everything to inflation pressures. And as I mentioned, not many small business owners have experienced anything like this. So navigating inflation and navigating price increases have been a huge challenge for many small business owners. The Ukraine war has certainly exacerbated this, specifically for some industries than others. But as far as not being able to get key components or supplies in inventory that they're looking for, that's still an issue. But right now, it's mainly having to adjust for those higher costs, input costs for small firms, and trying to figure out the best balance of absorbing those costs. So that has been the huge challenge for small business owners right now. Still there are some that are saying taxes and regulations are their single most important problem right now. But inflation, the last survey that was released last month, showed that 31% of small business owners are saying inflation is their biggest problem and having to navigate that. And it's a little different for small firms because the owner is generally the person who has to navigate this, look to see how to absorb these costs and kind of shuffling around, kind of their costs. And they don't have a lot of time to do this because they're also trying to fill those open positions that have been vacant for a very long time. So it's a lot of challenges for small firms. That is likely the reason that their confidence in business conditions in the next 6 months have declined significantly to one of the lowest levels in the 48-year history of the survey.
Thank you, Holly. Now let's turn to David Burson for sort of a 50,000-foot view, because he covers the whole United States from the middle of the United States, Columbus, Ohio. They like to think of themselves as the middle of the world, I think, the Ohio State University folks. David, let me just ask you, I've been reading overnight a number of research reports from various Wall Street houses that suggest we could see recession even by the end of 2022. Are you that pessimistic?
I'm not quite that pessimistic, Mike. Note that I'm also wearing what I would call a maize tie, not yellow, with beautiful blue M's on it that I don't often get a chance to wear in Columbus. But as a proud Wolverine, I wear it wherever I can. So I've got some interesting charts that we're going to put up here. If we can go to the first chart, that helps answer the question. So there are four big economic themes that are going on right now. First, the economy before the Russian invasion of Ukraine was doing pretty well. We'd come out of the COVID downturn, and even though we're going to get a pretty weak first quarter GDP number, underlying strength of the economy is pretty good. Second, inflation clearly picking up and made worse by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Bad thing, obviously. The most important thing, perhaps, is with the rise in inflation, we have the Federal Reserve tightening monetary policy. Well, they've just started to tighten monetary policy. They're at the beginning of what we think is a long tightening stream, and we're going to see interest rates go up significantly. And so my colleagues on Wall Street, who are looking for the potential of a recession, perhaps even as early as this year, we're not quite that pessimistic, get it from the Fed tightening and perhaps tightening too much. Let's take a look at a couple of the charts real quickly. So COVID, new infection rates have gone down. They've started to come up a little bit. But the important thing here is that state and local governments have reopened their economies because COVID is down, and that is boosting underlying economic growth. Next chart, please. One of the big impacts that we have seen from the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the spike in oil prices, but oil prices and other prices were already moving higher even before that happened, but this made it much worse. Next chart. And if we look at other commodity prices, this is wheat. Wheat prices have soared. Other commodity prices are up as well. Again, they were going up before the Russian invasion, but this has made it far worse. Next chart. What is the Fed going to do? The red dots are, and you can see two of them on there, are what the Fed expected itself to do when it came out with its own forecast in March. So the Fed expects that it will raise the federal funds rate up maybe to 2% by year end, maybe close to 3% by the end of next year. Financial markets, this is now about a week old though, expect far more tightening than that. With the federal funds rate, and we started at the beginning of March with the federal funds rate at 0, perhaps up as high as 2.5% by the end of this year, and maybe as high as 3.5% by the end of next year. And the big concern is if short-term rates move above long-term rates, a yield curve inversion, that has been a pretty good signal of recession. We don't have that yet, but if the Fed follows through on all the tightening that it wants to do, we could. Next chart. All right, here's where we are today. We've got the aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve for the economy, inflation high, economic growth pretty good. Now, what does the Russian invasion of Ukraine do? It is a supply shock. It moves that supply curve up to the left. What does that mean? Higher inflation and less growth. At the same time, the Fed is fighting inflation. It moves the demand curve down to the left. What does it do? It brings inflation down eventually, and it slows growth. The net effect of the supply shock and the Fed response to higher inflation is slower growth. Will it go below 0? I don't think it will this year. It could next year. I'm very worried about 2024. What will happen to inflation? Inflation is going to go up in the short run. It is now. But as supply chains heal, and ultimately they will heal, and we're seeing some signs of that now, and as the Fed tightens monetary policy and slows the economy, inflation will come down. Rapidly? Probably not. Soon? Probably not. But we're probably close to a peak in inflation, but growth is going to slow from here, and perhaps we'll see negative growth or recession sometime in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, David. Now let's start talking about what's happening in the world and the impacts that we're going to see beyond what everybody has outlined there. I want to turn away from the war just a little bit here and sort of set a predicate on China. There's a lot of expectation that the Chinese economy is slowing tremendously because of COVID more than anything else. And there's an old saying that when an elephant falls, everything underneath gets squashed. JP Morgan Chase does a GDP nowcast for China and is now seeing 2.2% growth, which the U.S. would love. But for China, that's a very terrible outcome. So let's start with Leland and ask him if you can sort of fill us in on the Chinese COVID response, what it's doing to the economy, and what it will mean for the rest of the world's economy.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting time to be discussing the state of play in China's economy, because you have your baseline. Here's what the data have been saying in the first quarter. We've got new data out in April that coming in a couple of days. Here's the state of play now, but here's what might happen if. And the if is COVID, but it's not COVID outbreaks like it is the rest of the world. It's about COVID lockdowns, and this is really the important differentiator in China. Anyone who's reading the headlines can see that the lockdowns that are being pushed in China. It was Shanghai. It may be Beijing soon. We'll see. Are of a nature that no one's ever seen. I mean, we're talking about quarantine for weeks and weeks and weeks. People shut into not just their neighborhoods, but their apartment building. There's been problem with food and medical supply delivery. But really, it's put a giant question mark on the entire year. Had we not had this Omicron spread that may become something more and may become something economically worse because of the lockdowns that are on top of it, we were looking at a year in which the first quarter probably bottomed in growth. The most important dynamic was that the Chinese leadership, unlike every other year where there's a party congress, and party congress is of course this conference that twice a decade the leadership gets together. They either appoint the successor to the leader, or they appoint the heirs apparent. A very big politically sensitive year. Every other time we've seen a party congress year, it's been just a monetary spigot opening, fiscal spending, boosting the stock market. It's just been a fiesta. And a lot of people went into 2022 expecting that, okay, 2021 was tight. It was difficult. There was a lot of de-risking by the government. But 2022 is a party congress year. How could things not be better? There was never been any sign that the Chinese leadership wanted to go more aggressive in 2022. There's been some headlines in the last 48 hours that maybe they're reversing some of this, but it's been a very, very calm government response to slowing growth so far. What makes this so difficult again is that lockdowns can change all of this. So you have a question first and foremost. If 20 to 30% of your population and up to 40%, 50% of your GDP is under some form of lockdown, even if you decide you want to push the button for a more active credit pivot, some more active monetary stimulus, can you even stimulate the economy under those conditions? So the question now is, how does China handle the slowdown in growth, which is going a bit differently than they probably thought a few months ago because of the Omicron spread and the lockdowns? And again, if they decide that they are in trouble, how are they going to respond from a policy side? I think this is why you're seeing all these headlines in the last, several days about how they're going to go big into property again, big in infrastructure spending. I'm not sure they're even going to do that, but it's been important for the government to send a signal that they do have a response mechanism in place. They do see the weakening of the economy. They are planning for some of these worst case scenarios, which could mean lockdowns not just in April, but in early May, mid-May, and even late May if things go negative and larger cities continue to get locked down. So right now, April 2022, I said a few weeks ago, was probably the most important month in China since January 2020. Well, now May 2022 is the most important month in China since January 2020, because we're really going to see not just about the spread of COVID and not just whether the Chinese leadership pivots on stimulus, but most importantly of all, does COVID zero ease up at all, or the lockdowns start capturing some of the bigger cities, in which case you have 2 months of relatively low growth in China and a really difficult time getting things back up again from a stimulus perspective. So May is going to be an incredibly important month, not just for the economy, but for policymakers trying to figure out what direction to go.
If I could just follow up, Leland, we normally ask what effect will China have on the U.S., but I'm wondering in this case, how much does China need the rest of the world? And I frame that in the idea that the developed nations of the world. A lot of countries are sitting this fight between Russia and Ukraine out, but the developed countries of the world, particularly in Europe and the United States, North America, are very down on the Chinese for interacting as they are with Russia. Is this going to cause a problem for China going forward, or do they not care what everybody thinks?
I think they care, but it's a lower priority. A few months ago, I would have answered the question by saying that the Chinese economy for a couple of years has been an engine, has been pretty impressive in its growth, but it's been about industry. It's about manufacturing. It's been about production, exports, et cetera. And all the headwinds going into 2022 were going to suggest that, manufacturing is losing momentum. COVID stimulus around the world is easing down. So manufacturing needs to be less of a growth driver for Chinese growth in 2022, 2023. The problem they have here is that with the COVID lockdowns, retail is getting destroyed. Services are getting massacred. A lot of the parts of the economy that the optimists were hoping would start to normalize, 2-3 years into the COVID recovery, are now going back underwater because they can't get things up and running when you've got COVID, but more importantly, when you've got lockdowns everywhere. So more than ever, there's going to be a reliance on trying to export their way out of this. That doesn't mean big devaluation of the currency or anything else, but it means that the regular growth drivers that they'd like to be leaning on right now are not available. So they had no choice but to stay reliant on some of these, exports and production that they have for the last couple of years. But what's happening now with the war in Ukraine? Well, European demand is cratering right now. You've got a situation where a lot of the demand from Europe is falling off. COVID stimulus has worn off the United States. There's a question of whether we're going to go into a recession anytime soon, as David had mentioned. So you've got weaker demand. You've also got COVID affecting some of the factories in China from the supply side. So this normally very reliable growth driver in China is under severe pressure. They need all the exports they can get. They need all the friendships and allies they can get during this time where they don't have much else to rely on. But will they have it? And so this is one of the reasons that this slowdown is a bit different than anything we've seen the last several years. And these relationships in Southeast Asia and other ones that are getting pushed and pulled because of the Ukraine invasion, they're more important than ever for China in 2022.
We had a report this morning that the trade deficit for the U.S. in March blew out $165 billion negative up from 106. I'm wondering, Holly, let's start with you. How much does what's happening in China affect your constituency? I realize that we're not talking about a lot of companies that are huge exporters, some are, but imports make up a good proportion of what the U.S. consumer buys. So how does your group see it?
Yes, so we just released a survey related to inflation and asked a bunch of questions among our members about those sorts of issues. And about still 44% are saying that they're not able to access the supplies and inventories that they need, key components of their business operation. A lot of that likely has to do with China shutdowns and not being able to secure those inventories and understand when they will arrive at their business. So that's still a challenge for them in navigating that. And 77% for the inflation part of it, inventory, supplies, and materials. 77% are saying that is a substantial part of their cost increases. And so it all is, a factor in how they're trying to navigate and what their experience is right now. Interestingly, 77% said substantially contributing to their increased input costs. And also 77% are saying substantial for fuel. And so the Ukraine part and China both are impacting small businesses to varying degrees. But they were still having to deal with, as was previously mentioned, higher fuel costs running up to Ukraine, and now it's just exacerbated. And so small firms, especially those who don't have a lot of options in kind of moving around with suppliers or have the time and energy, frankly, to try to navigate this, that would be more available to larger, medium-sized companies. But I mean, everybody's affected or impacted by this. Small business owners, just because they're the ones who generally have to make all the decisions and spend an exorbitant amount of time navigating these challenges, is very specific to the challenges faced by small firms versus medium and larger firms. But again, just less than half are saying that they are still unable to access inventories and supplies that they need, and likely, a decent part of that is the challenges with China. But then the fuel costs and all of that, while it was increasing before Ukraine, it has exacerbated, as I said. And so still most of them are saying that that is a huge challenge, and a challenge in a number of ways. So whether they use fuel oil for the business operations, gas for trucks, but also dealing with employees, driving and things like that. And there's a lot of pressure now on employers to increase those pays so that their commute isn't eating up more and more of their paycheck. But also, doing errands for the business, as I mentioned, trucks and big things like that for, say, construction and construction workers. It's just a mess. And they're not seeing, after talking with their vendors or other suppliers that they might be in communication with, it doesn't appear that they think this is going to go away anytime soon. So they are continually adjusting. One interesting thing, we asked this question a number of years ago, is how often do you look to kind of adjust your prices of goods and services? And right now, it's a third of them are saying weekly that they're having to adjust prices of their goods and services. Before that, it was maybe a couple times a year, if that, maybe yearly, maybe every 5 years. But now it's ramped up so much that they have to, pass or absorb most of those costs through increasing their prices. But they're trying to adjust in all sorts of ways. So, increasing their prices, unfortunately, in the immediate term, lower earnings, but then trying to be more fuel efficient, and unfortunately for some, just having to cut out some of the products and services that they needed before, and adjusting business operations that way to soften the inflation pressures that they're experiencing. But they're very pessimistic when looking 6 months out, not thinking that things are going to improve, unfortunately. And who knows what this looks like going forward. All the adjustments that they made, how much of that's going to continue on afterwards, or will they look more like pre-COVID, pre-inflation? Even last summer, when we asked about inflation pressures, it wasn't all that high. It was still in the single digits as far as their biggest problem that they're facing. But now it's almost a third saying that inflation is impacting their business. So it's a huge hurdle. We hear from small business owners every day about their challenges navigating these kind of two major world problems. And we're also even seeing we do ask, what is contributing? Is there a single product that's contributing to your increased costs? And if they're looking at inventory and supplies, and while it spans the gamut, there's still many who are saying wheat has increased in price for their input. But it's wheat, it's chickens, it's ground beef, it's still paper towels, the whole 9 yards that are affecting them. But it's a unique position for them having to navigating these challenges by themselves.
I suppose the good news is you can get hand sanitizer these days, which is one difference.
You can get all the hand sanitizer you want.
2020. David, Atlanta Fed GDP Now forecast for first quarter growth, and the GDP report comes out tomorrow, is for 0.4%, which is the lowest if you leave out the pandemic recession months. It's the lowest since 2015. But a lot of experts say it's going to be trade related and inventory related, and consumer spending is going to show up as still very strong. And given what Holly is saying, I'm curious. Yesterday we had the Conference Board consumer confidence numbers come out, and while people said they thought their incomes would be lower going forward, their plans to buy things rose. And so I'm wondering how bad the oil shock in particular, the energy side of it, and the other contributors to inflation are going to affect the consumer.
You know, that's a great question, Mike. The first quarter GDP number is going to be influenced to a considerable degree by trade and particularly by inventories. And if you look back to the fourth quarter, we had very strong growth in the fourth quarter because we had a surge in inventories. A much better way to look at GDP growth is look at it over the year. So the first quarter compared to the first quarter last year, and many other countries, in fact, emphasize GDP that way. And you know, if we get 0% growth in the first quarter, GDP is still going to be up by 4% from a year ago, which is pretty good. It's slower. There's no question the economy is slowing. Consumer spending is likely to slow over time. Income is good, may not be keeping up with inflation right now, but the job market is tight. Unemployment is remarkably low. Payroll employment month after month is strong and perhaps doesn't exceed the economists' estimates. But the economists' estimates have been pretty strong. So job growth remains just very, very solid. So income growth is strong. And as long as people have income, they're going to spend. Will they spend as rapidly as they did before? Probably not, but they're going to spend. How about businesses? Business investment spending, as you know, parts are very strong, parts are not. Businesses are not building new factories, so structures not going up very quickly, but equipment, you know, particularly things related to high tech, that spending has been pretty strong, and that's likely to continue. Perhaps with concerns about cyber, that spending will go up even more. So if you look at underlying spending in the economy, which is basically business spending and consumer spending, it's not bad. It's not the 0 to 1% that we're going to see in the first quarter. It's not the 5 to 6% that we saw in the fourth quarter, but it's probably in the neighborhood of around 3%, still above trend. It's still going to put downward pressure, at least for a little while, on the unemployment rate, and it's going to put a little bit of upward pressure on inflation.
To that end, we have a question from the audience, and I remind everybody, use the Q&A function on your Zoom, or you can turn in questions to Kelly Bush and the folks down at UCF. But David, let me just ask you what your estimate for inflation is for the coming year or two.
Well, right now, the 12-month change is about 8.5%. We think by the end of the year, we may see some healing in supply chains, and that may bring inflation, this is a 12-month change, down, all the way down to perhaps 6%. Now, 6% is darn high, but it's slower than we have right now. And if the economy slows more next year, as we think it will, although probably not go into recession, and particularly if energy prices go down. And if you look at futures markets for West Texas Intermediate, the benchmark measure for crude oil prices for the U.S., markets are expecting modest declines in oil prices over the next year or two. That's going to put some additional downward pressure on inflation. So by the end of next year, we could see the overall inflation rate perhaps down to maybe 3 to 3.5%. But 6% or so by the end of this year is still pretty high, even if less than right now.
Holly, let me start by asking you your inflation forecast, if you've got one, and then ask there's been a lot of question about whether Americans shift from buying goods, into more services. You've got a lot of service industries in the NFIB constituency. And have you seen that trend? Or as it seems to come up in sort of the data, are people just spending more on both at this point?
Well, when we ask about sales levels and if they, if their revenues are back to pre-COVID positions, many of them are saying, yeah, we're back there. Unfortunately for them, a lot of them are very frustrated about not being able to take advantage or of sales opportunities that they're missing out on, whether it's because they can't access enough of their inventories or supplies, or they can't fill those positions. And again, the historic low level of those seeing that business conditions are going to improve in the next 6 months. I don't have an inflation prediction here, but they're certainly seeing no end in sight right now, and they are continuing to operate under the conditions of having to increase prices and thinking through the next 6 months of what that might look like. When we asked about whether they are planning to increase prices in the next 3 to 6 months in the latest survey or the inflation survey, a lot of them, I think it was around 30%, are saying that they're going to have to increase prices, 10% or more. So it's nothing that we've seen before as far as small business owners. And I think it's just their communication with, as I mentioned before, their vendors, those who they have contact with in operating their business. I don't know that, they would see any relief probably for a while because, they're small, they don't have economies of scale as far as accessing those inventories as fast as maybe some medium and larger businesses in their industry. But it's, they are bracing themselves for inflationary pressures, increased costs of their inputs, at least through the summer into next fall. Hopefully it starts easing up sooner than later, but with inventory supplies and fuel costs, which is a huge component for many small business owners having to deal with increased fuel prices, any relief on those ends would be good news for the small business sector. And again, just because the owner is having to deal with all of this at once and doing the best that they can in absorbing those input costs. But their main contributors are supplies and inventory and fuel right now. So it's a tough road for them.
Now, for years, the Chinese economy, Leland, has been focused on mercantilism, exports, and then they started trying to change it to more consumer-driven domestic purchase environment. Does this COVID outbreak and the war set them back in that? And how do they affect the Chinese economy's development over the next few years?
I think it does set them back, but I think that they were setting themselves back even before COVID hit. The reason this is so important right now is there are some very big structural things happening in the Chinese economy. Even if you're not watching China very closely, you know that to 2021, there was a lot of financial sector de-risking. In the middle of the year, there's something people call the Evergrande crisis, property sector de-risking. They're trying to stop all of this reckless credit expansion going into the property sector to just try to juice growth. There's Beijing for as long as any of us can remember, has always been, setting out a GDP target, making sure they hit that target. And it's not necessarily real growth. They're, falling short halfway through the year and they just start building things. And so property has been this great growth driver for them in terms of hitting GDP numbers, but it's also been a very non-productive use of capital for them. They are trying to move away from that. And if you read party media, you listen to party pronouncements, they'll talk about the rise of the domestic, demise of domestic consumption, the rise of the Chinese consumer basically taking over as a growth driver going forward. But you got a real problem here. which is you can't just say, okay, consumption rise and it will rise. You have to structurally incentivize the economy to change. And so while they're doing these important things on the de-risking side in terms of ramping down this reckless credit expansion to juice non-productive growth, on the other side, when you're talking about do they have a growth driver like domestic consumption to rise up and replace it, what are they doing in order to structurally incentivize consumption? One thing they could be doing is to increase the value of the currency. So putting purchasing power in the pockets of households so they can buy more. They are not doing that. Right now, it's depreciating, but it's been range bound for a while because the goal of the government is for stability. It's good for the party. It's good for the economy. So they don't want to toy with the currency in a big way, either direction. Another thing you could do is you could just transfer state assets to the private sector, the household sector. You give them more resources for which to spend and to which to purchase things. Well, they haven't been doing that. As a matter of fact, the last several years have been the exact opposite. It's been more of a centralization. It's more of a focus on empowering, state firms. So they're not doing that. They could be materially broadening the social safety net. On the margins, they're doing that, but not in a way that is able to counteract some very negative demographic headwinds they have, not in a way where people will look at their spending power and say, okay, well, the government's taking care of this. I can, instead of saving up money to put my mother and father and grandfather and grandmother in an elderly care facility, take care of them in old age. Now I can go buy another TV set. That's not the mindset. So structurally, the question's always been, are they incentivizing this transition to more domestic consumption? The answer has been no, 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 no. It's been clear in the data that retail sales have been weak. Consumption engages have been weak. They're still weak. A lot of people forget, about the general trend here because they think of it as it's sort of a COVID dynamic, but it's much more beyond COVID. And as we emerge from this COVID era, there's going to be more and more pressure on the Chinese government to be creating this growth driver, to be empowering domestic consumers. The question is will they do any of these key things in order to push this transition? The answer until now has been no. And it's hard to see them doing any of these things in a big way in the near future.
David, let's ask about the U.S. and the Fed. We're decoupled from China. China's going the other direction, loosening some policies. Europe is sort of stuck in the middle. How much impact do you think the Federal Reserve tightening is going to have on the economy? A lot of concern about them moving until they break something, and yet interest rates, if they get above a neutral, Jim Bullard of the St. Louis Fed saying we go above neutral to 3.5%. Well, that's where the Fed started raising rates in 1994, and things were not too bad then. Is it really going to have a huge demand destruction component?
The Fed has to tighten rates by enough to slow overall demand in the economy. Otherwise, the impact on inflation is going to be small. And the Fed doesn't want the impact on inflation to be small. It wants the impact on inflation to be big. If you look back a number of business cycles, the Fed has successfully created soft landings where the economy has slowed but not gone into recession, and inflation has come down, I would say 3 times. Jay Powell says 4, but that 3 or 4. But we've had far more recessions than we've had successful soft landings. So if you look at history, will the Fed be successful in creating a soft landing this time, bringing inflation down, but not causing a recession? Well, historical record says the odds are against you. And if you look at the times when we've had soft landings, they've all been periods where we did not suffer from a negative supply shock. So when we've had these negative supply shocks, the historical record is very much against you. The Fed has had to tighten so much that we've gone into recession. I mean, the point is not to cause a recession. The point is to bring inflation down. But if inflation moves up by enough, if it is intractable enough so that the only way to bring it down sufficiently is to cause a recession, that's what the Fed has had to do in the past. We'll see what happens this time. I'm always hopeful. I hope that this is another successful soft landing. But if we continue to get supply shocks, COVID was the big one. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is another supply shock. The shutdown in China is yet a third supply shock. If we continue to get these supply shocks, even if they're not as big as the original COVID one was, it makes it far more difficult for the Fed to bring inflation down without having to raise interest rates by enough to cause a recession. I think ultimately this cycle will end, as they all do, with the Fed tightening too much. The question is it now, in the next couple of years, or is it farther out? Another thing that we've seen is that business cycles, the expansions, have tended to be longer over time. The longest expansion in U.S. history was the one that ended just, during the COVID downturn. If we hadn't had COVID, it would have been an even longer expansion. Will this one set up to be that? Again, I hope it is, but because of the nature of the supply shocks, I am doubtful. I think the Fed will have to tighten by enough in order to bring inflation down to cause that recession. Where does the federal funds rate end? In part it depends upon what long rates do too. That inversion of the yield curve where short-term rates move above long-term rates is a pretty good leading indicator of recession. But it's not the 210 that a lot of people in financial markets look at, the 2-year Treasury versus the 10-year Treasury spread. I'm a big believer, as I think the most members of the Fed are, that you have to look at a very short-term rate, the federal funds rate or the 3-month T-bill rate versus a longer rate, such as the 10-year Treasury. We're nowhere near inverting at this point. If the Fed tightens, let's say it brings the federal funds rate up to 2.5% this year, 3.5% next year, well, the 10-year right now is about 275. Does it move up further? Markets are pretty good at looking forward. Perhaps the 10-year doesn't go much above 3%. So if we get Fed funds next year at 3.5% and the 10-year is at 275 to 3, that's an inverted yield curve, and that's a real warning sign of a recession, perhaps in the second half of 2023, but certainly by 2024. So how much the Fed has to tighten will depend in large part on the behavior of long-term rates.
We have a question from the audience, so I'm going to pass it over to Kelly Bush there in the audience at the university, and she's got a microphone for our questioner.
Yeah, hey, Mike Scott Gray. Follow up to this, but it's a little bit longer term. Our U.S. national debt has now surpassed $30 trillion. We've had major impacts from COVID and now from Ukraine. What are the long-term implications of this national debt problem for us?
David, you want to take a crack at that?
I can certainly start at it. We've seen no real impact yet. The rest of the world is happy to give us their excess savings. Well, and as long as the rest of the world is happy to give us excess savings, then a rise in national debt here, while negative, isn't terribly severe. It means that more of our future wealth goes abroad, but only some of it. We can still grow rapidly here, increase wealth domestically, as well as sending future income abroad. But at some point, as the debt continues to grow and perhaps grows rapidly, does the rest of the world start to view us as, I hate to pick on them, but I will, as Argentina? Probably not Argentina, but do they become less convinced that we can always pay back our debts? If the rest of the world does start to believe that, even a little bit, it means interest rates here will go up, because in order to finance the debt, the annual deficits, you're going to have to give investors in the rest of the world a bigger return, because they're going to be more uncertain. So at least for some intermediate period of time, not now, but at some point, and we don't know when, interest rates in the US may be higher because of that, because we have to give higher rates of return to foreign investors. That's not a problem today, but if we keep raising the debt over time, it may well be a problem.
I know David Kotak would not be upset with the Argentine peso going down as long as he can be in Patagonia fishing. So maybe that is a good example. We have another question, but let me do a very quick follow-up to Leland, because the Chinese have been the biggest buyer of U.S. treasuries. Are they still going to be interested? We're going to have a lot more treasuries to sell them now that the Fed is no longer going to be buying.
Yeah, you had years in which the Chinese were buying more and more and more. This has stabilized, even gone down a little bit over past years. But the main issue with this is that in a perfect world, no one in Beijing would want to be investing in dollar assets. They wouldn't want to keep themselves held hostage to the idea that the U.S. controls the dollar and the Chinese economy, the Chinese leadership, the Chinese political system, Chinese financial system is beholden to the dollar, and so they would like to sever that link and buy buy fewer treasuries. There's just nowhere else to put your capital. I mean, you can diversify. And I think what the world will do over time, you talk about, will the dollar ever lose global reserve currency status? Much broader question. But what you're seeing already, and what will likely continue to happen, is that there will be a little diversification at the margins, some money at the margins going other places, but fundamentally, there's nowhere else that has the criteria that the U.S. bond market has. So the Chinese don't like the dynamic, but there's not much they can do. So they're sort of trapped within the current system until another asset is created that provides the same level of protection and good governance and liquidity.
All right, we have time for maybe one more or two more questions. So, Kelly, you have somebody there in the audience?
Hi, it's Roger Young. Question for Leland. The dollar yuan today is about 6.55. It puts it back to March 21 levels. Does this represent a strain for China in the euro dollar market? And what is the priority for the yuan in the eyes of the Communist Party?
I like that's the second part of that question a lot. So I'm going to start with that. The answer is stability, 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 stability. So if you look at what's happening, the dollar, everyone likes to talk about it. A lot of friends or FX traders, they like to look at how much the yuan has moved in the last couple of weeks, and it's something big happening. If you just expand your gaze to a broader 5-year, 10-year window, the yuan is relatively range bound. And it's range bound because it's a managed currency. It's a little bit of a float within a window, but it's a managed currency and it's managed against the dollar. What the Chinese government wants to do, what the Chinese Communist Party wants to do, is they want to piggyback on U.S. dollar stability through this by creating a parallel yuan stability. So you will see it move up and down based on dynamics in terms of the weakening economy at home, based on whether the dollar is being supercharged abroad. But what you'll see, and you'll also from day to day, from week to week, you'll see the government play some games in order to make sure that they're not sending out the signal that the yuan is a one-way trade for people to go in and try to make money off of. But by and large, what the government wants is stability, and so you're going to see this unless you have a break the glass type of economic emergency. You are going to see the yuan stay within a relatively normalized window vis-a-vis the dollar now and going forward.
All right, let me do a quick lightning round before we go here. I'll ask each of you to maybe answer in a minute or less, and I'll start with Holly. We have seen, I think everybody around the country has seen an awful lot of empty storefronts over the past 2 years. Now with everything going on and the uncertainty out there, is that part over? Is it going to get worse? Are we going to see more small businesses closing? Do we have people wanting to get back into business and maybe unable to because now interest rates are going up? What happens to small business?
Sure. So I think because of the census has a great program, the business formation statistics, and has shown a rapid increase in business formations and even, as they say, high propensity formations of those businesses that are likely or have hired one person so far. So those employer businesses. I think that this reshuffling of, whether you need a storefront or whether you can do this in some other way that isn't cost prohibitive. But, as walking down Falls Church here in Virginia, there's still a number of storefronts that are closed, especially in downtown. So I think there's a significant reshifting of where small businesses are located if they're able to adjust their location, maybe to the suburbs where things aren't quite so bad. But those in downtown urban areas are having a really tough time because of, not as many people going downtown to work. And so a lot of those businesses has shut down. But because of the nature of small firms, that massive churn of ins and outs of businesses, I think that adjustment, will continue, and they're doing pretty well so far there. But with the increase in interest rates, many of them already took out a economic injury disaster loan that was 3.7% interest rate. Still maybe have even some of the PPP loan money that was supporting them, but also for the using their own earnings to reinvest in their business. That's their number one form of financing their firm. So I don't know that the increase in interest rates is going to contribute much, because they do have financial instruments that they're using right now to help support business. But we'll see when all of that money starts running out that they've been sitting on, and how they'll adjust to a higher interest rate environment.
All right, Leland, let me ask you very quickly, less than a minute. We all know that the Trump administration was not very friendly to the Chinese, and the Biden administration has not really changed that policy. Where by the end of this crisis, whether it's 2022 or 2023, will U.S.-Chinese relations be?
I think it'll be worse. The last year or so, it's arguably been better. I'm not sure that the Chinese are very happy with what has been going on, but the Biden administration has been distracted and hasn't had a very tough crackdown on the Chinese on export controls or trade policy, and so you've seen this hiatus from interaction. Coming up, you've got the political midterms. Republicans are probably going to take over maybe both the House and the Senate. They've already got the a China plan ready to go in case the current China bill, competitiveness bill going through Congress right now fails. So I think that once we get into 2023 and we start heading towards the 2024 election, I think China is going to go back to the top of the list in terms of domestic, foreign policy priorities. And I think you're going to have the parties once again competing to be who's tougher on China.
We are pretty much out of time, but I saved the toughest question for David last. A lot of uncertainty about what will be happening by the fall. November 26th, Michigan and Ohio State. Who wins?
Both teams are going to be ranked in the top 10, and I suspect that at least one, perhaps both of them, will be undefeated on that date. It's going to be a tougher game. It's at the Shoe. It's not at the Big House. But I will go with Michigan, that Jim Harbaugh will pull one out.
All right. Well, we'd like to thank our panelists, Holly Wade, David Burson, and Leland Miller. And we'd like very much, again, to thank the University of South Florida and Dr. Holbrook for inviting us today. And we only hope the next time you do this, we'll all be able to be there in person. I'm Michael McKee. Thanks very much for joining us for this panel.
Thank you again to the panel. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break for you all here at USF and online, and we'll come back at 10 a.m. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Kennedy. I'm the CEO and Chief Investment Officer of RiskBridge Advisors. I also serve as the chairman of the Global Interdependence Center. I want to first recognize and thank Chancellor Holbrook and the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee, for a very longstanding partnership with the GIC. And of course, our friends at Cumberland Advisors, David Kotok, John Mousseau, Matt McAleer, who have been decades-long supporters and contributors to GIC mission. So it's good to be with all of you today. I'm honored to moderate this distinguished panel of capital market experts who will discuss the market impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're going to go around the virtual table for about 45 minutes with a series of questions. We'll leave some time towards the end to allow those of you in the audience who are interested, if you have a question, we'll try to leave some time for that. Natalie Cohen is going to be discussing the bond market. Matt McAleer will be covering the stock market. Brandon Zick will cover every other market, specifically real assets, focusing on agriculture and the food supply. So Natalie, Matt, and Brandon, welcome. If you would take 2 minutes, introduce yourselves and your firm, and then I would like each of you to share with the audience, both there in the Selby Auditorium and online, share with us, based on your analysis, what's one interesting thing or factoid that we may not know about this war's impact on the markets overall. So Natalie, why don't we start with you?
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. And thank you to everyone. I'm so delighted to be here. And I do wish I was in the auditorium with everybody else, but we'll put that off to the future. So my name's Natalie Cohen. I am head and founder of National Municipal Research, which is a research and analysis company working in mostly the municipal market, but also bringing in economics around the world as they affect the bond market. I would say, let's see, maybe some in the audience know this, but between Russia and Ukraine, together they produce 70% of the world's neon, which is a critical component to the production of semiconductors. And so many of you know that there's been a semiconductor shortage, difficulty producing electric vehicles and semiconductors and microchips for all kinds of other devices, the Internet of Things, so to speak. And two of the plants actually are located in Mariupol. I don't know if I pronounced that right, Mariupol, and in Odessa. Odessa's factory actually purifies the neon for production. We have no clue what the condition of Mariupol's factory is on that. But needless to say, there's a direct impact on car production, auto production, computers, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Matt McAleer, over to you.
Hi, I'm Matt McAleer, Director of Equity Strategies at Cumberland Advisors. And in terms of some effects of the Russia-Ukraine war, and they are multiple effects as we're seeing daily in the markets. But one interesting tidbit that actually I find fascinating in watching multiple markets, both equities, commodities, fixed income, both in the physical cash markets, which we're all familiar with. That's when you're buying a stock or buying commodities, and also the futures market, which is often a lead indicator of action in the cash markets, is how thin and volatile the metals markets have become over the last 6 months. So even beyond the Russia invasion of Ukraine, which often you hear the old Wall Street saw that the markets will always tell you what's going to happen. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, the markets were getting very volatile well ahead of the invasion. Even when Russia was discounting and denying that they were planning to invade. So the Palladium is Russia is the largest exporter of palladium, which is used in catalytic converters, timepieces, surgical equipment. Palladium itself has had a move in a 30% band over the last 4 or 5 months. And that's an awful lot of volatility for a metal that historically doesn't trade very volatilely. So in terms of futures traders, and you may have seen the news recently with the markets with zinc and so forth, those markets have become very, very thin, very volatile, and the margin requirements and so forth have started to be ratcheted up. So I keep an eye on those markets, because when we talk about something breaking, we'll probably see it there first, and then the after effects will flow through to the equity markets.
Terrific. Thank you, Matt. Brandon, over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and I'm happy to be here. I'm Brandon Zick, the Chief Investment Officer of Cirrus Partners. We're a boutique investment firm focused exclusively on investing in agriculture here in the U.S. across farmland and then other agribusinesses. I think the most unique aspect of what's going on in the markets today is that Black Sea region where the war is taking place is not only a very large provider of global grains, particularly to the Mideast, India, China, but it's also a large supplier of farm inputs that go everywhere in the world. But I think to some extent there's a little bit of confusion about when you talk about fertilizer and how much of that comes from the Ukraine. Very little of that actually makes its way to the United States. So while from an input supply issue, we think coming up on the first South American crop in September that there are going to be some dramatic effects. For the U.S., we think that'll be much more muted. And even for this crop year, we don't think that that'll be a big driver of supply shortages. But we've already pre-war been in a situation where global grain supplies have been stressed, and it's going to make its way through the system from whether it's grains into protein, dairy. So we think we're in for a pretty long ride, and the futures markets, as Matt said, are telling us that. If you look at commodity prices, there's no silver bullet, there's no quick fix. It's going to take a sustained effort to increase production because we don't think demand is going down, and we're going to need a lot of cooperation from Mother Nature to make that happen globally.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks all three of you. Let's get into a few questions here. So Natalie, I'm going to start with you. You are an expert on state, local governments, municipalities, and we know that there have been some of the states here in the U.S. that were exposed to Russian assets, either through pension investments or other means. Can you provide a little bit of color as to the magnitude of Russian asset exposure at the state or local level? And have all of those governments, local governments or state governments, been required to divest of those assets?
Yes, to your last question, there are, at the state level, are the largest of the pension funds. The magnitudes vary, but they're not super significant. But the question is, if you're divesting, at what price and how much do you have to write down, and who's going to actually buy the assets? So CalPERS, for example, which is the largest, California issued, a dictum to divest, and CalPERS actually owns some illiquid assets. Between the liquid and the illiquid, it's up close to about 800 million, which is a minor portion of their overall assets. But some of the illiquid assets, for example, they have a joint ownership of a shopping mall in Moscow. So that is not going to be easy to divest. It's a joint partnership with the Heinz company, Texas real estate company. And so they are questioning, they will be trying to divest, but the question is at what price and at what time will they be doing that? They're not rushing into it. And I suspect that pattern, that's certainly true in the Pennsylvania school district pension, Connecticut. There are a number of other states that have spoken about their assets. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the overall asset base of public pensions.
Okay, thank you for that, Natalie. Matt, a question for you. You talked about market turbulence in commodities, turbulence in volatility in the metals market and the interest rate market and the equity market. Talk about the equity market for just a second. How do you see the war in Ukraine directly affecting the equity markets, both here in the US and internationally? Is it only a potential earnings impact? Is it multiple compression, something else? How do you think about it from an equity perspective?
Yeah, specifically, the war going on currently has impact in certain areas, and Natalie mentioned neon in terms of semiconductor production. It does have that direct impact. But more broadly, what a large-scale war. And I'm not defining this as a large-scale war today, but what a large-scale war that this could become does is take the peace premium out of the market. We've traded with a peace premium now for, you could say, post-Korean War. The Vietnam War didn't have as much market impact as we might think. There was inflationary impact. But we've had a wonderful market stretch where peace was factored into pricing, was factored into risk. And if you take away a peace premium, it's very difficult to factor in that piece to pricing. We all know that markets discount, whatever market it is, let's talk about equities, discount to the worst case scenario. The market is a discounting mechanism. So right now, perhaps, worst case scenario is supply chain headaches, some food pressures, a number of one-off items. Worst case scenario on a weaponized warhead launched into Asia, into Ukraine, with perhaps some flow into Poland, a NATO country, which by Article 5 forces NATO to respond. So when I look at the equity markets and what's happening within Russia, Ukraine today, this may sound odd, but I think the pressure on the equity markets today is more trying to reprice in higher interest rates from the Fed. I know nightly we see headlines about Russia and Ukraine, and that's a human tragedy. In terms of the market, I think we're dealing more with the fear of higher rates and the Fed not being able to get in front of inflation than we are Russia and Ukraine directly. But that peace premium in the markets, and by the way, that's in all markets, not just the equity markets, that's something that has to be considered.
Thank you, Matt. Brandon, Matt just talked about food and food pricing and food insecurity. We've read that Ukraine and Russia account for a very large percentage of many important elements, whether it's materials or agricultural inputs like fertilizer. In your opinion, Brandon, what's the potential impact on future grain pricing and food pricing? Can you put some parameters around how you think that this will play out in maybe the rest of this year and then going into 2023?
Yeah, and I definitely think you have to look at it in both a short, immediate term perspective and then over the long term. From the short term perspective, what we have now are ports closed in the Ukraine, a lot of grain that was grown last year that would typically find a home in the Middle East that is unable to be shipped. So from a supply chain standpoint, that's a short term impact. You're seeing spot prices for corn and wheat specifically, which are the two largest grain exports from the Ukraine, along with vegetable oils. Right now those prices are almost 100% higher than where they were a year ago. If you look out in the futures market 2 to 3 years, you see that it's about 30% lower than that. So while the futures market is still anticipating higher commodity prices and grain prices specifically than where we were a few years ago, they think there'll be some, over the intermediate term, increase in supply. To Matt's point, that market is not pricing in a black swan event. So to the extent that where we sit today, we have grain that's not being shipped, we have fertilizer that might not make its way to South America for the crop season that starts in September, which that will exacerbate the pressure on short-term supply. There's nothing that over the longer term that's being priced in. That black swan event, in our opinion, would be some type of chemical weapon, nuclear weapon that would potentially impact soil quality, water quality in that Black Sea region, and Russia potentially using famine as a form of foreign policy. That's the weapon that we would view as we would then need to rethink how everything works. In the U.S., we're really blessed from the fact that we're an exporting nation. We supply domestically most of our fertilizers. The potash that we do import, which a lot of it globally comes from the Ukraine and the Black Sea region, for the U.S. comes from Canada. So we think that we're going to have access to that. We could decide domestically, do we want to continue to export major foodstuffs? I think Europe is really questioning going forward, should they continue to do that now versus how much domestic supply do they need to build? Across the world, there only exists about 20 to 25% of global grain supply sitting in storage. So that's just over 2 to 3 months. So I think at that point, you really need to think longer term. How do you meet the demand that's out there globally? And the U.S. is well positioned, but it's going to come at a higher price. I don't think availability will be the issue. I think price will be the issue, and food and fuel for most Americans are going to be the two components of inflation that they feel the most acutely.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, Brandon. I'd like to all three of you to opine on the question of higher energy prices. We've seen crude oil hovering around $100 a barrel. It's been higher, it's been a little bit lower, but around the $100 per barrel mark. Natural gas prices are going up. So for all three of you, could you just speak to, Natalie, we'll start with you. What's the impact of higher energy pricing for states and municipalities, and as you think about the municipal bond market?
Right. Well, the joys of the municipal bond market is its diversity and nuance. So you have states that are oil and gas producing states, and their revenues are up already. We're seeing it. So obviously Texas comes to mind, Wyoming, New Mexico, Alaska, a bunch of other states, North Dakota, and so on, that are seeing that. And as I'm sure Brandon can speak to, the grain producing states that are exporting are also seeing higher revenues. So all of that comes down into the state coffers and filters down to the local level, depending upon what's there. So Texas has always been a somewhat of a counterpoint. So as the prices go up, they do great. Everyone else is suffering and putting, higher price gasoline into their cars and so on. So that's affecting stay-at-home folks. They're going to continue. More people will say, I'm not going to drive every single day to work. I'm going to stay home, save a little bit of money on my gasoline, on the inputs.
Okay. Matt, how about for the public markets, either equity or commodities or even FX?
Well, Natalie makes some great points about trying to focus on where you can find benefits to some of these higher energy inputs we're seeing, whether it's gas or oil. There's another old Wall Street saw that does have, I think, some reality to it, is the cure for higher commodity prices are higher commodity prices, because those higher commodity prices drive supply from the producers. And with Brandon here on my right, he probably knows that line more than anything. If there's a crop that is staying at a high level and projected to stay at a high level, farmers will switch their fields or attempt to switch their fields to take advantage of that. As much as the drillers in Texas have been saying that the federal government is somewhat restricting their drilling, you always have to differentiate between what someone is saying and what they are doing. The Baker Hughes drilling numbers, which are released weekly, have gone up every week since January. So their board of directors and shareholders of these companies are not going to allow a barrel of oil, which hit 135 intraday a month ago, to be at that price and not have these companies drilling. So their biggest problem right now is what many of the industries are facing, and that's labor and parts, maintenance. So that's more what's holding up the drilling. That drilling is coming online. I can see it weekly in the numbers. So those higher prices will bring out more production. Again, what would really cause a long-term disturbance, and if we look at the futures charts in oil, 2 years out, and without getting into real specifics, 2 years out, oil, West Texas is being priced at about $70 a barrel versus the 100 today. So what we're talking about is being worked on and traded on and invested on daily. In terms of where we're trying to take a position, where we're positioning some capital, is in some areas that can benefit from a prolonged bid to commodities. And our largest single country allocation in our international strategy is Canada. So we feel that we need to start pointing capital to areas that can benefit economically, from this. Again, I can go on forever, so I'll add one other thing and then pass it over to Brandon. But just yesterday, we added on the pullback to our metals and mining position in our domestic strategy. That's a basket and ETF. It's XME, just to give you some information. Had a heck of a run this year for us. It's pulled back with the rest of the market. We added to it. That's in specific metals and mining companies, and some internationally, primarily domestic. So I think we have to try to focus on some areas that will see profit margins stable to rising and have the wind at their sails, and instead of trying to sail through the wind.
And Brandon, how about for agriculture? How big is energy as a percentage of cost for a farmer, for agricultural companies?
Well, energy costs make their way into the farm input sector in a number of ways. Certainly fuel is a large cost, but natural gas is a huge component of nitrogen fertilizer production. It's also a large component of chemical production. So there's a number of ways that this hits farmers. If you're a grain farmer, there is some benefit from higher ethanol prices because they are a bid in the market on the buy side for grains. But that old adage that Matt talked about, high prices solve high prices, we saw that in effect in 2012, which was the last time we had grain prices at these levels. That was mostly due to a sustained increase in demand and then a large drought in the United States. And what you saw were incremental or swing acres come on in other parts of the world. So in Brazil, they continue to convert over the Cerrado, they cut down the rainforest. There's a lot of ways to bring acres on outside of the U.S. Within the U.S., acres go down every year. But the problem you have now is that to bring on those new acres, you need a large investment in fertility in the soil. And right now that could be cost prohibitive. So there won't be, in our opinion, a quick move to be able to bring on supply elsewhere in the world that historically that had been the case. So we're gearing up for a longer term increase in commodity prices. We think that oil and gas being high are going to be a driver of that. But primarily we're growing foodstuffs. And as the population in the world continues to grow, there still is increased demand for protein, increased demand for grains. And the only way to do that is to produce more with less. And that becomes more difficult as prices go up. So I think even within planting intentions across U.S. farmers, we're seeing a bigger shift towards soybeans because that is a lower input cost crop requires less nitrogen, less risky. So they're pulling some chips off the table, whereas they might make more money growing corn. There's just too much risk involved in that because of higher inputs. So that's going to impact supply, I think, pretty dramatically come the fall, particularly if there's any type of weather event here in the US, and typically that would be a drought or something that happens in South America that prevents planting. And then you have this, the whole reason we're here today talking, what happens in the Black Sea region? Can they plant those acres? Can they export what they grew last year? And that's all going to impact price, not only in the short term, but into that medium term as well.
Great. So we have some questions coming in from the audience. Let me interject a couple of those into the conversation. So one question, what is your projection for the dollar if Russia succeeds in requiring rubles or gold for settlement of their hydrocarbon exports to Europe or into Asia? So what's the dollar view based on how Russia is using their energy exports as a geopolitical tool? Matt, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure, and there's many different inputs affecting the dollar. So sometimes we focus on one. The dollar has been ultra strong in the face of much analysis talking about a weakening dollar and the dollar being replaced as the global currency, the top global currency. Well, the markets disagree 100%. Difficult to think, Bill, that Russia demanding payment in rubles will have a direct effect on the dollar. The ruble market, like the Russian equity market, has been really a closed market. And you could say the ruble market is just being propped up by Russia. It would be difficult to think the rubles would make a dent in the dollar. What would make a dent in the dollar? It's difficult to say. I'd like to see the dollar weaken a little bit. We're in a scenario right now where you have some, and this is what's fascinating about the markets, you have some very odd cross currents happening. Historically, strong dollar would put pressure on commodities. Yet here we see commodities coming off a 12-month run. If we look at, say just some broad indices, commodity indices of, 60, 65%, 70% moves in 12 months, right in the face of a rising dollar. So what we try to think of when we're talking about allocating capital is, if the dollar weakens from here, do commodities get a second leg up? Because that's the traditional trade. Weak dollar, emerging markets, commodities. So it's difficult. The dollar's, from a technical standpoint, a little overbought right now. Would make perfect sense for it to pull back. But boy, is that trend strong. So a strong dollar can be problematic to both the equity market and the commodity market. It's kind of like the three bears. You'd like the dollar just right in the middle somewhere. But
a little less
my 2 cents.
volatility would be okay. Absolutely. Very thoughtful response. Thank you, Matt. Brandon, a question for you. How does a Kansas wheat farmer react or respond to what's happening globally with a supply shock to his or her main crop?
Well, if that Kansas wheat farmer knew back in the fall what was going to happen, they probably would have planted more wheat. But that's not how it works. So that's one of the reasons why it's difficult for a wheat supply to come on from the U.S. in response to a price movement, because typically they're planting hard winter wheat that was planted back in the fall. So what we're seeing now is most likely that Kansas wheat farmer is going to book some much higher revenue this year it'll cost them a little bit more to fertilize and spray that crop because nitrogen is a big input there. In talking to our farmers that we work with across the Midwest, in many cases they use wheat as a cover crop, and many of them are looking to determine is that a viable crop that they could then harvest instead of just use as a cover to try to be in that market. But like I had said earlier, there's no quick fix. I think longer term, if you look at the grain complex in the US, corn is typically the highest revenue, most profitable, then soybeans, and then wheat. And wheat is really used in areas that have better soils and better water. So the farther east you move across the Mississippi, wheat is really not a very prevalent crop because it has not been that profitable. That may change somewhat, and you'll see that become more evident in a crop rotation or crop mix. But U.S. farmers are usually very good, especially on the row crop side, of identifying how they can be profitable by rotating crops. That helps to not only decrease the necessary fertility investment in the soil, it decreases what they have to use in terms of chemicals or spray to control weeds and pests. So I think farmers tend to not move too quickly. When you see big shifts in acreage intentions, we're talking about 3 to 5%. You're not going to see the ability of farmers to move to 50% more wheat acres or 20% more corn acres. That just doesn't happen. And I think most farmers are pretty thoughtful about, over the long term, how do they manage through these markets to help maximize revenue in some years while reducing input costs in the following years.
Understood. Thank you, Brandon. Natalie, we've got a couple of questions for you. If you could address what you're seeing from a credit worthiness standpoint, and this could be property, commercial property prices, residential property prices around the country. We are starting to see mortgage rates, to Matt's earlier comment about the Fed and the Fed policy change being so prevalent, mortgage rates are now rising. How does all of this second order and third order effect come into play from your perspective?
Right. There's a number of second order things that are coming into play. I'll just mention one other one real quick. The core credit revenues in the municipal market are sales tax, property tax, and income tax. We all know about that. No one expected sales taxes to boom as we did the work from home and the lockdowns the way that they did. And that was to the benefit of state and local governments, because most of the states, especially in the South, used sales tax as a significant revenue source. Property, people were moving from high density cities into less dense because of COVID. And so property values, given shortages in new home construction, secondary purchases, and so on, that has boosted property values tremendously. We've seen, I would say, given the future higher mortgage rates and slowdown in the economy overall is going to put a bit of a damper on that. But right now, the revenues coming in on property taxes are pretty strong for state and, more to the point, local governments. I wouldn't be surprised in the near future if we start seeing some tax limitation measures coming up at the voting booth. It mimics what happened in the 70s. In the late 70s, we had Prop 13. We had a lot of other states enacting tax limitations and so on. I would not be surprised as we move into the next presidential election. Those are typically the years when ballot measures show up. And then finally, I do want to mention climate. And I know some people in the audience are keen on that whole topic. Until we hit 2020, we were on a trajectory to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce oil and gas purchases and so on, and produce more electric vehicles, put in the charging stations and all that. I would say that that's a casualty of the Ukraine war to some extent, and the shift over to oil and gas production opening up the reserves, opening up federal leasing of mineral rights, and so on and so forth. So there is a real counterpoint that's going on. Hopefully, the forecasters, some of whom are in your audience, say that we're going to have an above average storm season in the Atlantic Basin. Hopefully the Midwest farming community is not whacked this spring with heavy storms. But those are factors that are, again, maybe third degree up, a couple of levels. People are not laser focused on that and have kind of shifted their viewpoint to how are we going to reduce the cost of gasoline, oil and gas production, and so on.
Terrific. Thank you for that, Natalie. We have a question. Let me read it, and then I'll pick on a victim here. What mechanisms exist for leading the Middle East to pump more oil? And I would add to that, or is it more likely the U.S. may begin to pump more oil and gas? And Matt, maybe you are my victim. If you can maybe just talk about the supply shutdown in the U.S., a lot of that gets blamed on ESG, but we know coming out of the pandemic, many of the oil and gas companies, the production companies, had to repair their balance sheet. They had to go through a multi-quarter period of strengthening their balance sheet after a horrible period. Maybe you want to take a crack at that. First, where's the most likely spot on Earth where more oil could be pumped? And how do you think that might impact the credit and the equities for the major oil producers?
First, Bill, I think the Middle East is probably pumping all they can right now. I think there may be a thought out there that the Middle East is holding back to perhaps lean on the U.S. or damage the U.S. The Middle East they've been trying to pump. One of the things that is another peace premium tended to be, what could we do to focus on the environment? And as Natalie mentioned, war supersedes ESG. And that's just human nature. War is survival. War is short-term survival. ESG is long-term. So, of course, the short-term focus is what gets focused on. Bill, you're exactly right. When oil briefly went to negative, what were 2 years ago now, right? 2 years ago. Yeah, you had exploration and drilling companies, many bankrupted, many forced to raise capital keep in mind with oil, even when it came back to positive, it sat at 10 and 15 and 20 and $25 for quite a while. These companies are triple B minus credits, double C credits. They're having to raise money at 8, 10, and 12%. That is expensive debt on their balance sheets. They did have pressure from the government on running their business. To what extent, we can all argue about that, but there was pressure. So we really got behind the eight ball in terms of energy production. When you go to a point 4 and 5 years ago, now I'm not talking about ESG and so forth, but when you go to a point where you were able to supply domestically all the energy you need, to a scenario over the last 12 months where we have to all of a sudden ramp up just to bring supply on. The planning probably wasn't there. It probably had to be a dual input plan from Washington and the exploration and drillers, and it got a little bit too confrontational. Now, hopefully that's behind us. And by the way, you can still bring on supply with an eye on the climate. They're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes the loudest voices on both sides get all the attention. And that's in politics, that's in anything politics touches. The reality is producing oil and gas in the US today, and this is just a recent white paper I read, is almost 10 times more efficient in terms of dirtiness to the climate as it was just 20 years ago. That is, oil and gas companies today in the US are technology companies. Oil is just a product. And the technology that has been increased and used in Texas and in Pennsylvania, it's fascinating. And sometimes there just needs to be dialogue to take advantage of this technology and not try to frame either or as the bad guy. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. That strong hand that I mentioned that we have in agriculture, because we're an exporting country, you know, we export 40% of what we grow. We certainly have that capability on the energy side, and it's a little frustrating for someone who's pretty pragmatic to see us waste that opportunity. I think to Matt's point, what happens in the U.S. is as clean as anywhere in the world, if not cleaner. So if we're going to do something, I think in terms of oil and gas exploration, I think from the ESG standpoint, it should be encouraging that here domestically with better regulation, better monitoring than what happens in Russia or other parts of the Middle East. So I hope there's a policy change over time. We'll see if that happens. But you're right, the war will exacerbate and really force that discussion to happen.
Sure.
So, Brandon, this is a topic and presentation on Ukraine and Russia's invasion. We haven't talked about China and China's reaction. China's watching carefully how the Europe and NATO and the U.S. are responding. Can you help us understand from an agricultural and food import perspective, where is China? Has anything changed? And how's that impacting the investments that your firm is looking at?
Yeah, I wish Leland was still on to talk about this too, but I think China is right in the bullseye right now. They are a huge importer of global grains. For every soybean that's grown in the world, 2/3 of that bean ends up in China, primarily as livestock feed. Historically, China's always been a domestic producer of corn. Last year, they became a huge importer of corn because of a crop failure they had. They are not self-sufficient. Their soil contamination, water contamination, the inability to grow a crop to feed their population puts them, I think, in dire straits. There's a reason why they've had these investments in all other parts of the world in infrastructure to try to be able to buy grain, buy food stocks to bring in, and primarily in places like Brazil, that's their largest trading partner for ag. I think right now, Brazil is also in a little bit of a tough spot because they're going to have a hard time sourcing some of the fertilizer they need for their crop later this year. For the 2022 crop in the U.S., all of the fertilizer we need is at local levels, local distribution. And while that price for next year may be higher, we think there will definitely be availability. In other parts of the world or the globe that supply China, they are going to have a much harder time sourcing those inputs, which ultimately means China will have a harder time sourcing the grain that they need. And when you have totalitarian governments, the one thing they cannot afford is a hungry populace. So I think every effort will be made to try to source that going forward, but there is no 2 or 3 year pile of grain stocks sitting somewhere in the world. it's 2 to 3 months. So if there's any supply disruption, whether it relates to the war or simply Mother Nature, we're going to see a pretty quick whipsaw on not only commodity prices, but the availability of those commodities for all of those food importing nations. So I think that's what I would keep my eye on more from just the global dynamic. Where is there just no availability regardless of price?
Thank you, Brandon. So we're coming up to the top of the hour, a few minutes left. Let's, Kelly, if you're in the audience, I want to see if there's anybody in the audience that would like to ask a question. I think we have a mic available.
Hello, Bill. This is Bob Bunting, the CEO of the Climate Adaptation Center. And boy, you've made some wonderful points here. I have two comments. One is informational. Ukraine and Russia produce about 14% of the world's wheat, so it's not inconsequential. However, the United States is in an epic drought situation in parts of the grain belt, including the wheat belt. Some of you probably know the western half of the quarter of the U.S. is in a 1,000-year drought that is historic by any nature, including Lake Mead being at the lowest point it's ever been in since it was constructed as far as water supply. But in the wheat belt, 36% of all the winter wheat is rated as poor or very poor right now in condition. And only 30% of the wheat is rated as good or very good. So as this harvest comes in, I really believe it's going to put more pressure on grain prices, especially wheat. And so that's a factor to think about in the inflation. And also just a quick comment about energy efficiency. We always think about drilling more oil or gas, and the U.S. is really getting much better at being efficient. We produce only 15% of the greenhouse gases in the world these days, which is a great improvement. But the other part of it is that a third of the world's energy goes into heating and cooling buildings. And those buildings could be retrofitted right now with technology that exists right now, that the U.S. makes right now, and we could cut our carbon footprint and increase our exports dramatically if we decide to do it. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for joining. Thanks for your comments, and it's good to hear your voice.
Okay, we have another one from the audience.
Thank you.
The question concerns North Korea. They're already a hermit state, and they import the vast majority of their wheat and grain and everything. What do you see as the impacts on North Korea?
Well, from our standpoint, less global availability for exports means worse conditions for North Korea. And I think across the board, any of these grain importing states that have little to no currency value makes it very difficult it's going to be very difficult for them, as there are supply shortages, to be able to access that. We even see in the U.S. there could be a push for fewer grain exports into the global market to help secure domestic supply. I certainly think that will start happening in Europe at some point because of what will happen there in terms of whether it's natural gas or fuel shortages, that there's going to be a push to do that. So I think across that just global grain importing market, you're going to see higher prices, less availability, and more scrambling.
Other questions?
Bill, it's David Kotok at USF. We have a hybrid event, and here we have an audience, and then we have a bunch of listeners. You're the chair of the Global Interdependence Center. And I might point out to those who are virtual and those who are in this room, every panelist that you saw in each of these sessions and the next session are members of the Global Interdependence Center. And the Global Interdependence Center is a neutral convener of dialogue like this worldwide. I wonder, Bill, before we close this session, if you could spend 2 or 3 minutes now that the GIC is back in business again. I know you're going to be in Paris. We're going to be in Paris in a week and other places. Can you give us a 2-3 minute where the Global Interdependence Center is going to be in the next year before we're back in USF's auditorium for another session?
Which we can't wait. But thank you, David, for the shameless plug. And David will collect your GIC dues for anybody who would like to join this morning. So the GIC is going back to live events beginning on May 6th. We'll be in Paris for a central bank series at the Banque de France. We'll be hosting a conference here in New York City on May 19th, focusing on long COVID, with a very distinguished day, a day of very distinguished speakers, focusing on the economic impact, the policy impact, the political impact of long COVID. We'll be heading out to the Rocky Mountains, to the Jackson Hole area for the Rocky Mountain Economic Summit in July. And then going into the second half of the year, we will have an ESG conference at Rowan University. We'll be traveling to Montreal for an event, and probably a trip back to Madrid. So we're very excited to be reconnecting with our friends and our network. The GIC, as David mentioned, is fully committed to hosting events like this that are nonpartisan. We explore every side of an issue. We do so in a very neutral way, in a neutral format. And then we also have just a wonderful organization called the College of Central Bankers, which you'll be hearing from shortly. And College of Central Bankers, which is chaired by Peter Gold, has really built a tremendous platform for us to deepen our relationships with all of the monetary policy makers, not just in the Federal Reserve System here in the US, but with former monetary policy makers from around the world. And so very excited about what's happening at GIC, and we're very honored to be participating in this event today. So thank you for that, David. Before we close out, let me just, I want to do a speed round, if I could, with our terrific panelists while we have them. So very simple question. In the next 12 months, US will see a recession, yes or no? Natalie?
Sorry, I had to unmute. I think it's possible. It's hard to handicap it exactly, but the slowdown is starting to appear, and there are areas where, where it could affect certainly people, property, revenues, companies, and so on. So that's a kind of a squishy answer, but we'll see.
We'll take squishy. Matt?
By the definition of recession, I'll guess no. I think we'll see enough of a slowdown that it's noticeable, which would probably be a benefit to inflation. Remember, there's a benefit and a negative to anything that happens. David was saying earlier when we were chatting, my famous morning lines are, what can go right, what can go wrong in every security we own, in every industry we own, in every country we own. And I think you have to look at that on almost any decision you make or want to make or have an opinion on economically. So I guess recession, a negative print, 2 quarters in a row. Recession and markets are two different things. I also say we don't trade recessions, we trade securities. So whether we have a recession or not, we have to be positioned in the best way to help our clients. If we have a recession and we're positioned properly and our clients do very well, then we did our job, recession or not. But I would think the fact that we are coming off such low rates that perhaps people are getting ahead of themselves, thinking a 3.5% 10-year Treasury bond, we're not there today, we're at 275, is going to be enough to crack the economy. May slow it. I'm going to lean against that for now.
All right, a market is forming. We've got the bid-ask spread between Natalie and Matt. Brandon, you're the final decider.
Yeah, my guess, like everyone else, is in the next 12 months that it would be unlikely. In the next 24 months, I'd say it's more likely. It's all going to depend on the actions of the Federal Reserve, in my opinion.
Terrific. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to, first of all, thank you for paying attention and for joining us today. Please join me in a big round of applause for our panelists, who I think did a fantastic job. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, and thank you to the panel. We're not going to break. We're going to go to the final session, and I think we're a minute away. Let me just say a word while behind me people do important work so we don't lose the flow of the session. The Global Interdependence Center will soon be 50 years old. During its period of time, it has evolved from monetary and trade policy worldwide to a much larger agenda. And recently, it has been developing the College of Central Bankers. And I think we're now live, and you can see 2 more GIC members. One of them, the chair of the College of Central Bankers and a vice chair of the Global Interdependence Center, is Peter Gold. Hello, Peter. It's nice to see you on a screen. And I'm going to let Peter officially introduce my newest best friend, Kasia. She is a fellow in the College of Central Bankers. And the College of Central Bankers, which Peter will tell you about for 2 or 3 minutes before we hear a keynote address, is a unique structure in the world. In earlier times at the Global Interdependence Center, I chaired the Central Banking Series. In those days, we didn't have to deal with these monumental financial shock issues that are confronting us today. We would go somewhere, we would have a nice meal, we would talk about central banking, we might talk about payments. No one wanted to hear about how payments were made. It was a sleepy subject. And then we'd have a nice dinner, a glass of wine, and we'd say, gee, Paris was wonderful, or Rome was wonderful, or Tokyo, or Singapore, or wherever we happen to be. That has all changed. And so what Peter can describe, Peter, maybe for 2 or 3 minutes before you make the introduction.
Sure.
What is the College of Central Bankers? How do we get such distinguished personalities, including our keynote speaker? And tell us for 2 or 3 minutes what's happening, and then we'll go to the program itself.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. I come to you from the other sunniest states in the United States, Phoenix, Arizona, where yesterday was 99 degrees, but absolutely charming. So, yes, David, thank you. I want to thank you also, David, for your leadership in the Global Interdependence Center, and particularly in the College of Central Bankers. You are a true visionary and greatly appreciated. I also want to thank the University of South Florida, Dr. Karen Holbrook, who has attended and been part of and a partner on many of the Global Interdependence Center programs. We're delighted at the College of Central Bankers to join you this morning in this capacity as well. It's my duty to introduce our keynote speaker, but David has asked me, and I wanted to share with you a little bit about the Global Interdependence Center's College of Central Bankers. So formally started in 2018, and 2019 was the full operational year. We now have 19 individuals who we title fellows in our College of Central Bankers, each of whom has been the president, the governor, or on the governing board of a central bank or central bank type organization. The purpose of the College of Central Bankers is to do what this program is doing, which is providing a platform for thought leaders throughout the world. And we have various activities at the College of Central Bankers. One is a survey, and perhaps, Bill Kennedy, our chair, suggested a topic for our next survey, which is just straight on interest rates, and see how our fellows feel about that. So we'll look at that issue. So surveying is one of our topics which we are trying to continue to mature. Another project is something we call the Institutional Alignment Project. And we are so excited to participate today because this topic falls within the Institutional Alignment Project's footprint so squarely. That project seeks to look at whether these institutions, central banks, and similar organizations around the world are fully equipped to deal with the problems and opportunities as they are evolving. Now, remember, we started this project back actually in 2019, 2020, and matured it a little bit in 2020, where the major problems were the pandemic, debt levels, independence of central banks, interdependent of central banks, climate threats. And then in addition to those comes the war in Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine. So that itself, as you can imagine, and we'll learn more today from a true expert on this, what implications that has on central banks, central banking, and not only regional economies, but the world economy. We'll learn more about that. So this will now also come under our Institutional Alignment Project. So that's the GIC's College of Central Bankers. We also have a very vibrant and robust advisory group, of which David Kotak and other audience members and panelists here today are, some of whom are members, and we thank them for their participation. And with that, let me get to my order of discharge for this morning, which is to further introduce Katarzyna. So Katarzyna Kuraska currently is an executive director of the World Bank Group, and she represents 9 countries, including Poland, Switzerland, Serbia, Azerbaijan, and 5 Central Asian states. She's a former member of the management board of Poland's Central Bank and former deputy finance minister. She has also just returned from Warsaw and on a mission, which I'm sure she can disclose aspects of it to us, if not fully. And her talk will also include implications of the war on Ukraine, neighboring countries, and our global economy, relief recovery, potential reconstruction efforts. For instance, do we need a new Marshall Plan or similar type of organization? And what are the impacts of refugees coming into places like Poland and other areas? And, as we look at the economic global perspective, does this actually lead to the question of, do we need another Bretton Woods conference? And who would be invited to that sort of conference, and what would the topics be? So with that, if you'd like to learn more about the College of Central Bankers, please go to the Global Interdependence Center's website, interdependence.org. And I'm so happy to introduce Katarzyna, who, David, I join you and say, yes, she's a wonderful fellow in our College of Central Bankers. And thank you. The floor is yours, Katarzyna.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, David. I would like to thank GIC and, of course, University South Florida for this invitation today. It's a great honor to be with you. I do regret that I am not with you in person, but we are just after so-called spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, and still there are a lot of meetings here in Washington. So I was unfortunately kept in here in Washington, but I was listening with big interest to two sessions this morning, and indeed there are a lot of issues that I would also like to raise and comment that you have already discussed in details, but definitely it's worth also to reflect them given the current situation. I was asked to give some perspective from Poland. I was recently, as Peter mentioned, I was recently, just a week ago, I returned from the mission. I joined David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, in his visit in Warsaw to meet with the authorities, also to meet the local authorities as well, to see how the situation is on the ground, given the huge inflow of refugees. So I also would be happy to give you more feedback on that. Well, let me focus first on the implications of the war on Ukraine, neighboring countries, and global economy. Well, Russia's war against Ukraine has massive humanitarian consequences and detrimental repercussions for Ukraine. The economic growth decline in Ukraine itself is expected to be around 50% this year, due to huge deceleration of economic activity and infrastructure damage. Lives and livelihood are being lost. More than 10 million people are forced to leave their homes. Around 5 million people, mainly women, children, and elderly, have fled the country, mainly to Poland, but also Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia, while the rest are being internally displaced. The refugee inflow into Europe has already exceeded that from Syria in 2015-16. So we have definitely unprecedented inflow of refugees into Europe, something that we could compare with the Second World War. Well, as I mentioned, I could visit Warsaw just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and I have to tell you the situation is completely different as you could have been expected in other countries. For example, there are no single refugee camps in Poland. All refugees are accommodated to the private homes or hotels. So you don't see, like in the other refugee crisis situation, people fleeing to and kept in the camps. The refugees receive the full access to the labor market and public sector services, including education, health, and transport, which is also a little bit different than, for example, in many MENA countries where hosting communities, hosting countries are restricting access to the job market or to public services. So we have already seen that many kids are enrolled, Ukrainian kids are enrolled to school. People are actively looking for a job, but the number of refugees are definitely overwhelming. So this is already more than 2.5 million of people that they cross Polish border. As I mentioned, 5 million people that they fled the country. Many of them, of course, they are staying in the neighboring countries because they still believe that this war will end soon. But Some of them, of course, they moved to other Western countries, US and to other continents. But majority of them are stay in Eastern and Central Europe. War pushed many of citizens to poverty. And the World Bank just recently published the report of the implications of the war and estimates that the poverty rate could rise to around 60% of population by 2023. 60%. It's incredible number, given that Ukraine is the upper middle income country. The war has completely disrupted Ukrainian agriculture. There was a lot of discussion also in the previous panel about the agriculture market and the food prices and the wheat prices. Ukraine and Russia are the world's bread basket, and the war has triggered a wave of the steep price hikes around the globe and threatened to push another 50 million people to extreme hunger only this year. So we have extremely not only local implications, but we have definitely global implications. Just to compare the numbers, the agriculture market plus food processing industry in Ukraine and trade is around 20% of the GDP of Ukraine. So you can only imagine why we expect such a huge decline of the economic activity. Well, the war as well as the sanctions imposed on Russia have significantly impacted macroeconomic developments in the neighboring countries and the global economy through direct and indirect channels, as Ukraine and Russia are major exporters of commodities. The war has triggered a further increase in commodity prices, especially food and energy. Also, there was a lot of discussion this morning about that. We see enormous inflationary pressure as a result of the food prices, currency depreciation, capital outflow, and this altogether forced many central banks to raise interest rates. So we have already noted that many central banks in Central and Eastern Europe raise interest rates. In Poland, the interest rates were raised already seven times as inflation has reached the highest level over 20 years. The war also triggered a spike in the risk aversion in the global financial market, which has a negative implication on the debt sustainability. We might see another wave of defaults. Many countries already pre-COVID and pre-war had the debt distress situation. So we might see more and more defaults. And with interest rates going up, we should expect that rather sooner than later. Trade routes and global value chains are disrupted, so this will have global implications. So we have crisis on top of the crisis. After 2 years of pandemic, the global economy faced another shock. Many international financial institutions revised down the economic forecast for the global economy, and all the post-pandemic recovery sets back. As I mentioned, we have just completed the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank last week, and both IMF and the World Bank revised down forecasts for Europe, for Central and Eastern Europe, for Russia, and of course for the global economy. So there was a question before this panel about the recession. I agree, maybe there will be no recession, technical recession this year, but we should rather expect a sharp hard landing going forward. Now I would like to focus a little bit about what should be done in the short term and the medium long term. Speaking about short term, I mean about the humanitarian aid. So only to address the dire situation and the humanitarian crisis, Ukraine needs about 11,000 tons of humanitarian aid per day. Food and medicines are in the largest demand, with almost 7 million of internally displaced people across the country. Access to food, water, and essential services is becoming severely constrained. To cover only social spending, pensions, and salary of the public sector, the country needs around $2 billion a month. Given the dramatic decline in tax revenues, the budget deficit this year will widen to around $20 billion. And without access to capital markets, it will have to be covered by donors and international communities. There is no other choice. So it is essential to support Ukraine now in this phase, but also to give them hope for the better future. And the preliminary assessment of physical damage of buildings and infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, core energy, transport, water, sanitation, and telecommunication infrastructure could be as high as $100 billion. But I have to tell you that I have seen already many estimates with every day of war. The number is, of course, rising. We have seen dramatic pictures from bombarded cities. So with every day, the number of the physical damage is going rapidly up. Hoping that the war ends soon, it's important to start preparations for recovery and reconstruction of the country. The new so-called Marshall Plan is needed to revive Ukraine's economy. Ukraine will have an opportunity to finally shake off some of the legacies of the past and leapfrog to a more productive, sustainable, and inclusive economy if the war is over. This will need a solid plan focused not only on reconstruction and rebuild of the infrastructure or housing, but on a strong institutional framework, which is crucial if Ukraine wants to become a member of European Union. Well, there was many visits to Ukraine with prime ministers, but also with the European Commission president. In recent weeks, a lot of hopes and support a lot of support is promised, and it's raising hope for the reconstruction when the war ends. But we are still at the war, and we don't know how long it will take. But definitely, it's a right time to start thinking about the next phase. And I'm pretty sure that Ukraine will need a lot of resources. But given the lessons learned from pandemic, but also from the war, there is a chance that Ukraine can reconstruct, building back better. With that, let me turn again to Peter for your comments and questions.
Thank you so very much. Very, very thoughtful presentation, packed with a lot of information, and I'm sure our audience, both virtual and in person, has many questions for you. I just had one that I'd like to start off with. And recently, the International Monetary Fund released a joint press statement from the heads of international financial institutions and programs on the Ukraine. And it was very succinct in going through what each organization is doing in the Ukraine. And the EBRD is $2 billion of euro contribution. EIB is another $2 billion in emergency packages. CEB has 1.4 billion. The World Bank has now said that its financing part of the Ukraine will be targeted at around $3 billion package for immediate expenditures. If you were asked to prioritize the top three things or top two things that needed to be done as a global community, both to preserve the Ukraine and enhance it, but also for the global communities. How would you prioritize? What would those elements be?
Thank you very much, Peter, for that question. You indeed mentioned about what we have discussed last week with many IFIs about the coordinated support for Ukraine. But you dropped numbers, and I also mentioned in my presentation what are the needs assessment, and you can easily add the numbers, and you will see that Ukraine will definitely need much more money, even on the monthly basis, to survive and to still pay to the public sector and pensioners they monthly pensions or salaries. So what are the priorities? First, we need. So still, as I said, we are at war, so we still need to support Ukraine with humanitarian aid. They need a lot of resources, food, medicines, everything for the daily survival. But going forward, as I mentioned, there will be not only the reconstruction and rebuild, which would give Ukraine to focus on building a green, resilient economy based on what the new technology and the new situation brings to us. Given all this energy and food security discussion that we have around the globe, definitely we will have to reflect on how to accommodate those trends to rebuild of Ukraine that is so far interconnected with Russia and other countries in the region on food and energy sector. But definitely what is the most important for building strong economy that would be a viable candidate for the membership in European Union, we need to build strong framework and strong institutional capacities. Ukraine faced a lot of issues in the past with corruption, with setbacks in many market reforms. So this has to be allowed. Deregulation of the economy, liberalization to allow market economy with strong institutional framework to build on this, to build those strong pillars. But as I said, now we should focus on the humanitarian aid, as this is extremely important on the daily basis, but still preparing for the reconstruction plan. For both, I mean, physical assets, but also for strong institutions.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is take a few virtual questions. Then we're going to go, hopefully, Kelly, you can help us with this, go to the audience for some questions. But virtually, there are a few questions that come up. So let me try to put them together in this way. There has been, as you noted, a mass exodus out of the Ukraine to neighboring countries and other countries. Does a country such as Poland, a host recipient country of immigrants, does it need, and they need, some sort of financial aid? And what should the world be doing vis-a-vis those countries in consideration of this fact?
Thank you very much, Peter. Of course, yes, as we are hosting more than 2.5 million people in the population of 38 million size country, definitely it means that every fifth or sixth person in Poland already is from Ukraine. And these people are mainly women, children, and elderly people, so they need access to the public service and job market. So definitely, yes, this is a burden, fiscal burden on all neighboring countries. I have seen some estimates that if the war continues and we will still keep the same the same number of refugees, so not more, Poland might need around 11 billion euros till the end of the year. 11 billion euros, which is around 10% of the annual budget. It is really a lot of money, but if we add all other countries, Romania, Moldova is in very difficult situation because this is a small country outside the European Union with a huge inflow per capita. It looks like almost 10% of the population are already people from Ukraine. So they have enormous pressure on the fiscal situation. So definitely all these countries, particularly Moldova and the countries outside the European Union, they need immediate support to host refugees and support them.
Thank you. So my plan is to take one more virtual question, then to ask my friend David Kotak to perhaps coordinate the questions there in Florida. So another virtual question. Actually, there have been a few on this. How will Poland cope with Putin shutting off natural gas? And what are the implications of that?
Well, this is a very difficult question. I have seen that the news yesterday, and I was shocked to see it, that Poland and another country, Bulgaria, was shut off the gas. I have seen a reply this morning from Prime Minister who said that Poland has gas reserves at least for 2 months. So let's say some coverage for the short term, but you cannot replace that gas so easily within a few weeks or months. Poland has already, over last years, prepared for the diversification of the energy sources. So the process has started long time ago. We have LNG terminals to get the liquid gas also from US and other countries, but this is not the capacity is not as large that could easily replace gas from pipes, from pipelines, and this is really a problem. The good thing is that it happened now during spring, summertime, when the gas demand is much lower than during the winter time. But definitely emergency planning is needed. I also have seen many confirmation from the Polish government and other governments in the European countries that they are actively coordinating among themselves about the common European market and to support each other in that situation, as we are all together at war, have implications of that war. So yes, so this is something that will require coordination, but also to speed up investment in alternative sources of energy. So when I was in Warsaw 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of discussion if this situation that we have on the eastern side, whether this will trigger the energy transition faster than it was expected before, whether we will invest more in the renewable energy, in the solar, or wind, offshore wind, and others. Yes, of course. The question is, of course, yes, but it takes time to build those solar farms, solar plants, or wind plants. So it will take some time.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. David, I hope you do this for us and come on and help us organize the question and answers from there.
Yes, thank you to both of you. We're learning our way here with a hybrid meeting in which the virtual section drives the meeting program. So, for example, Bill Hampton of USF and I have been in conversation outside of the cameras talking about the fact that what we didn't do is have a mobile camera. So when we have a questioner in this audience, everyone would be able to see the questioner. But we're learning. This is the first time we've done something like this, and we have several hundred people in total watching this. So let me ask the first question, which came to me from email, and it came from Vincenzo Sciaretta, who is a financial journalist in Milan. And Vince and I know each other for many, many years. We wrote a book together on Europe so long ago that things have remarkably changed since that. And he was my co-author on that book. Vince asks, and this is a general question, Katja, so you take it wherever you think you are able to. If we're in a climate where interest rates worldwide are rising and central banks are changing policies and mostly tightening, and we have extraordinary gaps in interest rates. For example, the 10-year Chinese government bond yields today a lower interest rate than the 10-year US government bond. And the Russian short-term interest rate in rubles is 17% as a policy rate. How, I'm paraphrasing the email, how do you, in your capacity, and how do you see the responses because of the rising interest rates in this massive financing need in front of us that you and I spoke about on the phone and you have now seen? And whatever the estimates are, they're going to go higher. How do we deal with the interest rate issue?
Well, this is David. Thank you very much for that question. This is an excellent question. I think that many central bankers are now analyzing the situation, whether they should be quicker or slower with monetary tightening. Of course, the trend is obvious, in my opinion, because we see what's going on with inflation. So definitely, it requires some decisions of central banks, but of course, investors are always looking at carry trade and gaps between interest rates. But there is always also in the kind of situation a kind of flight to quality, and investors, when they are concerned about the situation, they would rather pick the asset that is maybe not less profitable but more secured, I would say. The good example of that would be Switzerland. They have negative interest rates and they have a huge capital inflow. So I don't think that always this plays that way, that if you have higher interest rates, this will attract more capital. Rather, I think that in the uncertain time, people will also look at the credit situation, but also on the asset quality, which is the most important, in my opinion. But as I said, I am not a central banker anymore.
Well, we're in the realm of opinion. So a second question that was emailed, and it came from Paul O'Brien. And Paul O'Brien formerly was the chief strategist for the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, and he is back in the United States. And he sent a note and he said, while we think about the debt financing in dollar and euro and yen and the G7 currencies, isn't there a possibility of formation of ruble finance from those who are allied with Russia, and they might become a source of buying Russian debt or other related parties' debt if we're dividing the world from what used to be to something new?
Well, I think that it would be great to address that question to the audience, because there are a lot of market experts that they can also answer that question. Well, definitely, if you ask me, the world that we know is over. And we have to be prepared for the new trends globally, given the dominance of how the world has changed over decades. And now we have the dominance of China as a second largest player at the globe. So I am not sure if the next, let's say, the reserve currency would be ruble, or rather we will have the strengthening of yuan or Chinese currency given that situation. So I am not sure if this will strengthen ruble or rather this will be the opposite.
Thank you. We have in the room Richard Miller, retired in Sarasota. In his former life at Prudential Insurance Company in Newark, I should say, to paraphrase the show of Hamilton, he was in the room where it happened. And I asked Richard earlier if one might do something like talk about what would happen in the room where it happened were he in his old position at Prudential and we would have this outbreak. And two, I think Richard has a question. So he's got 2 minutes for each or less.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, David. I want to thank David and the other organizers for putting this timely and stimulating conference together. I'm reminded, before I answer your two questions or pose, that it's almost precisely 25 months ago that I came to your conference here on Investor Day, and you greeted me at the door wearing a blue surgical mask. And it was the first time I'd seen anyone wearing a blue surgical mask at an event like this. And you said, you know, in your inimical style, there's something going on in China. And everybody in this room has flown on a plane. And if you like a mask, you had a box of masks available for everybody. It was prescient. Scary prescient. And that was my first encounter with COVID. And for many people in that room, I suspect it was the same. And now we find ourselves 25 months later, having lived through and living through what is probably the most extraordinary historical moments in our lifetime in respect of the word that is in your activities of the Global Interdependence Center. Interdependence being the operative word. It's demonstrated these last 25 months how interdependent we really are on each other as human beings, as countries, politically, and it's being underscored every day by what's happening in the Ukraine. In the room, just to break that train of thought for a second, I'll come back to it. In the room where it happens, when crises like these emerge, in my experience back in the crisis that David's referring to in my professional life, was the Lehman bankruptcy, which to me and in my life, that this crisis we're living through now and the crisis of 2008, 2009 were the most dramatic crises that I have ever experienced. And in the room where it happened in that case, people anticipated the potential for a Lehman bankruptcy at the highest levels of Prudential, at the top of the rock. We had meetings where we worked on scenarios to anticipate it and what our moves would be in the markets. And I know people in this room are very concerned about the markets. So we had a battle plan. And we executed on that plan at the highest levels. We did very well coming through it all. And everybody was very cool, calm, and collected. There was no sense of panic. Nobody was pulling their hair out. We had a very large exposure to Lehman, but actually we were holding Lehman's cash collateral to the extent of $500 million. We still had exposure to them. Markets are volatile every day, but we got out of the positions and life went on. Then, of course, all the other stuff began to happen with, AIG and the banks and all the fallout of the Lehman crisis, and we worked our way through that as well. But the important thing that David gets at is in the room where it happens, you need to be cool, calm, and collected. Okay, so take that. Now I go back to the question for our participants here. The name of this conference is Ukraine, What Next? With the subtitle Financial and Economic Impacts. But let's, if I may, broaden the question to what's next in any respect, not just financial. And ask our panelists, what keeps you up at night when you think about what's happening right now in the world as we face what's going on? That's my question.
Thank you, Richard. Kasha, what keeps you up at night?
First, I would say every day before I go to bed, and the first thing when I check Twitter in the morning is whether still there is fight in Ukraine, whether they still survive. So what will be the bad news that they will be defeated? So definitely it keeps me all the day and night awake. And the second would be inflation. I'm so concerned about inflation. I remember when Peter asked us a few months ago in a survey, what is the biggest concern? And I answered, yes, inflation will be on the rise, and this will be a steep increase, and they will stay for longer. So I'm very much concerned about the decade of relatively high persistent inflation.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go back to taking a question from our audio Zoom audience. So it goes something like this, if I can restate it. So with environmental disasters and other threats going on around the world, if we focus a little bit on fertile soil, water, clean air, have these issues in the Ukraine and in Europe and elsewhere been part of any discussion about the recovery for Ukraine or for Europe or other parts of the world? Have the environmental or climate change issues been included?
The answer is absolutely yes. So even during the pandemic, when we started conversation in Europe about post-pandemic world, it was building green and resilient economies. This was the most important. We had the Green Fund established with a Green Recovery Fund with a lot of investments going around environmental and climate issues, including energy transition. So definitely this war will also speed up the entire process. So not only for European Union countries, but including Ukraine, this is a very timely discussion, and it has to be included to the recovery phase, because, as I said, they can leapfrog based on the new technologies and so on when they will reconstruct going forward energy sector. They can use the newest technology and to build a greener economy going forward.
Peter, we have 3 questions in the audience, and we're up against a bit of a clock. So if it's all right with you, may I get around the room in here? Okay, thanks. So I see Christine Schlesinger, whose family's origins are from Ukraine.
Right. So
Please.
that's actually why I wanted the microphone. I'm Christine Holovata Schlesinger, and my parents lost everything in the war, the World War, and emigrated through Poland as so many are now again doing. First of all, I want to thank the beautiful people of Poland. And neighboring countries who have also welcomed Ukrainians. I want to know, how can we Americans help those Polish citizens and Moldavan and Slovak citizens who have been so generous?
Thank you very much, Christine, for your question and for your nice words. I very much appreciate that. I'm very proud of Polish citizens. I have many friends that they host refugees in their homes. So I'm so proud of them. And how the world can help. Of course, there are a lot of initiatives. There are a lot of trust funds that could be financed to support refugees, to support Polish families that they are hosting. Well, I don't even have one or two solutions, because there are a lot of different accounts and actions via the humanitarian, Red Cross, and other. Definitely, there are many. I can provide that offline if you are interested too.
Thank you. We have time for two more. So Chancellor Holbrook and General Gray.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your really excellent comments. Thinking about this, it's been weeks, only a few weeks, to almost destroy a nation. How many years do you think it will take? And how long do you think we'll have to be connected, and we all will have to be, to build back this wonderful country?
Well, there is no answer to that. First of all, we don't know what would be the next stage of the war. Whether we will see the end of the war soon or not. Whether the country will be completely destroyed or not. You have seen all pictures from Mariupol, which is completely damaged, bombarded to the ground zero. I can only tell you that Warsaw, that was my capital city, my home city, was completely damaged during the Second World War, which was more than 70 years ago, and this is still rebuilding. So we still have buildings that remembered bombardments and damage. We received a lot of support from European Union for reconstruction, for the cultural heritage, because we couldn't do it by ourselves. So definitely it will take decades.
Last question from General Gray. Scott?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank Katarzyna for her really tremendously sobering presentation there. You mentioned the Marshall Plan. I think this is what it's going to take to rebuild the country, is something along that. And it's time for the UN to step up and take the lead on something like this, I think. You also mentioned the lack of humanitarian refugee camps. If this continues to go, we will have huge problems here and massive refugee camps, which gets me to the 24th of May, where we're going to be talking specifically on humanitarian issues. And I'm going to try and bring in a Department of Defense expert on how you build these refugee camps, such as we had to after the Afghanistan withdrawal. But I want to sum up something, because today has really hit home. And I think we need to start looking at Putin a little differently. Putin is not a dumb man. He took control of a country. He's maintained control. So in some ways, he's absolutely a brilliant man in those respects, okay? But right now, don't forget what General Breedlove said in our first presentation. Putin has said the worst calamity, I'm paraphrasing, that's ever happened to the Russian people is the loss of the USSR, all right? So right now, today, we know that's his goal. Restore the Warsaw Pact, if you will. The world is playing chess with a war criminal who has nothing to lose. And we now need to start thinking like that. And I want to go back to your point, because what you said just really struck home. What's next? I want to rephrase that. In my opinion, It's not what, it's who is next and what is next. Because Putin has already said, if Sweden or Finland try to join NATO, which General Breedlove said would be fast-tracked, he's already said they are next. So he's not going to stop, and we need to start thinking about him differently. He is, in the eyes of the world, and I predict will be condemned by the world court as a world criminal, as a war criminal. With nothing to lose, what's to stop him?
We are about to finish what has been a very strong, cobbled together in a matter of weeks, morning on finance, economics, markets, and this remarkable shock, which is unprecedented in financial global history. And I need to thank the panelists that have been with us all day, and certainly thank the GIC's College of Central Bankers and its chair, Peter Gold, and our wonderful keynote speaker, who unfortunately was not able to come and be here in person, although she tried and we spoke about it. And so, Kasia, when the opportunity presents itself, we would welcome you here in Sarasota and love to have you visit us in person. Let me close with a couple of comments. On May 4th, Russia will default on $40 billion in credit default swaps. That's the largest credit default swap default ever. There's a controversy about the payment mechanism. We do not know how this all plays out. Scott and I have been discussing the need for continuing dialogue because we're facing something that is probably with us for years in its aftermath. And so when this series with USF, which started only a few weeks ago, is over, we're going to plan to try to continue it. And those who can't see her, Karen Holbrook is sitting there nodding her head with a yes. So I suspect we'll be able to come back to this auditorium. I wrote a piece yesterday on Russia default. It's available to anybody in the auditorium sitting on a counter, and anyone else who's listening can obtain it on Cumberland's website. Let me close with just one note. I'm working on my 5th book. It's in its first draft of a manuscript now, and it looks at pandemics, epidemics, throughout 3,500 years of history. And it looks at the economic shocks that come out of such things. And 2 things are striking. The shocks that come after pandemics are different from other shocks. This was triggered by a study done at the Federal Reserve Bank at San Francisco in 2020. And there's a working paper by 3 folks who did some very serious research on 19 pandemics over 700 years, starting with the Black Death in Europe. What I'm trying to do is extend their wonderful, brilliant work to more of history. So it's been quite a journey in the last 6 months or so. The observation I would share is, in the putting together the book, there's another observation. Every pandemic has a link to war. Every pandemic in history either preceded was coincident with or followed very quickly war. Scott last night was talking about cyber war, which we're going to talk about, and how cyber attacks reduce the capacity of water and sewer plants and therefore trigger disease. That's a military application of this issue. In preparation for my book, I looked at pandemics, the first one. The first epidemic of which there's a written record is 3,500 years ago in Megiddo. Some of us would think of that as the site of the Armageddon in biblical terms. And in that, in Megiddo, there was a king, a regional king. And that was a time when all jurisdiction in the world was Egyptian. And he inscribed a cuneiform plate, and he sent it to the Pharaoh. And he said, I need soldiers because I'm losing so many because of the plague. 3,500 years ago, first written record of the word plague. When Sparta and Athens were at war in the Peloponnesian War, Sparta launched the attack on Athens. A year later, the plague broke out in Athens, killed a third of the population, decimated the Athenian city-state defense, and Sparta won the war. Why didn't Sparta experience the same impact from the same disease at the time? Because in those days, wars were fought seasonally. And it just so happens, by coincidence, that there was social distancing between Sparta and Athens. So the plague devastated Athens, but it didn't spread to Sparta because it was in the seasonal period when you couldn't move chariots around in mud. And we just saw a tank battle change because of mud. So this remarkable history, let me end with one fact. The IHME at the University of Washington is probably as fine a source in factoring pandemic COVID-related excess deaths. And they have models, like so many of us here and in this room. We use models to make estimates. And we get close. The only thing we know about our forecasts when we make them is they're wrong. The idea is to get close. So the IHME has a model of every country in the world, every state in the United States, frankly, every county. Russia has stopped for months reporting COVID death statistics. They repeat the statistics. If you use the IHME model, which is a 6-factor model, it adds in both the good and the bad. People wear masks, they don't get as much flu, not as many die of flu. People don't wear masks, there's more flu deaths because they're not protecting themselves. IHME doesn't tell you to wear a mask or not wear a mask. It says, here are the statistics and here's how we put them together, the good and the bad. When you look at the IHME estimates over the last 9 months, the highest per capita death rate of major countries is Russia from COVID. 4 times the released numbers. So you have to stop and ask yourself, do we see the results that were repeated in history without an exception? Spanish flu, World War I, where did it spread? Think about that history. And so I don't know where this goes. None of us have a forecast. What we do know is we are in remarkable times. Not any one of us in this room 3 years ago would have been able to predict we would be standing here today having this discussion. So thank you to the Global Interdependence Center. Cumberland is proud to support it. And there are members of GIC in this room. And anyone who isn't a member, it's, I don't know, it's $100 a year or $200 a year. We'd love to have you. Thank you to the University of South Florida. It's 25 months, Richard reminds me, since I had a mask on and stood here. Thank you, Karen. And to my new best friend, Scott, thank you very much. There are box lunches. Am I right, Bill? Box lunches, and there's a nice salubrious place to eat them outside in the courtyard. And that completes our conference today, and we're on time. We did it. Thank you very much.